Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The gastronomic shadow of Chef Pascal. The air in Loose Serpent Carrit, the laughing serpent, was always thick with the scent of thyme, roasted garlic, and something else. Something subtle, almost metallic, that clung to the velvet drapes and seeped into the very bones of the old building. Chef Pascal Dubois, a man whose hands moved with the precision of a surgeon and the grace of a dancer, presided over this culinary kingdom. His reputation was legendary, his dishes bordering on the mythical. Diners would whisper of flavors that awakened forgotten memories, textures that defied description, and an aftertaste that lingered for days, a haunting, exquisite echo. Pascal himself was a study in contrast. Tall and gaunt, with eyes like chips of obsidian that seemed to absorb the light, he rarely smiled. His movements were economical, his voice a low rumble that seldom rose above a murmur, even in the heat of a busy service. Yet, when he spoke of food, a strange, almost manic gleam would ignite in those dark eyes. Food, he'd once told a wide-eyed apprentice, is not merely sustenance. It is an experience, a transformation, a communion. The apprentice, a young man named Antoine, had shivered, though he couldn't say why. Antoine had joined Loose Serpent Carrit 6 months prior, drawn by Pascal's formidable reputation. He'd expected grueling hours and harsh critiques, and he got them. But he also found something else, an unsettling obsession that permeated the kitchen. Pascal's pursuit of perfection bordered on the pathological. He would spend hours, sometimes days, perfecting a single sauce, discarding batches with a frustrated sigh, muttering to himself about the essence, the soul. The strange metallic tang in the air grew more pronounced over time. Antoine noticed it most when Pascal was working on his signature dishes, the consommé de Ames Perdue's, consommé of lost souls. A broth so clear it seemed to capture light, yet so rich it felt like a physical embrace. Or the pâté de la nuit éternelle, pâté of eternal night, a dark, velvety creation that tasted of earth and something indefinably ancient. One evening, a delivery of prime beef was late. Pascal, usually unflappable, paced the kitchen like a caged predator. "Unacceptable," he snarled, his voice rising for the first time Antoine had ever heard. "The essence, it will be compromised." The restaurant was fully booked, and the main course for a table of influential critics hinged on that beef. Suddenly, Pascal stopped pacing. His eyes, fixed on Antoine, seemed to bore into him. "Antoine," he said, his voice eerily calm, "true culinary genius demands sacrifice. Sometimes the finest ingredients are not found in markets."
Antoine looked nervously.
"Chef, what do you mean?" Pascal's lips curved into a thin, unsettling smile. "Come with me." He led Antoine to a rarely used, heavily padlocked cellar beneath the kitchen. The air here was damp and cold, carrying a faint, sickly sweet odor that made Antoine's stomach churn. Pascal produced a heavy iron key from beneath his chef's coat and unlocked the door. Inside, the cellar was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. Antoine's eyes widened, then his breath hitched. Hanging from hooks were what looked like carcasses, not of animals he recognized. They were too large, too strangely proportioned. And the smell, the metallic tang from the kitchen was overwhelming here, mixed with something else, something distinctly human. Pascal gestured with a flourish towards a large, pale form hanging closest to them. "This, Antoine, is the secret, the true essence, the most tender, the most flavorful, the most human cut."
Antoine stumbled backward, gagging.
"Chef, what is this?" Pascal chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "This, my dear boy, is the ingredient that elevates my cuisine from mere food to art. The je ne sais quoi that critics rave about. The secret ingredient of Loup Serpent Carrot. He picked up a gleaming cleaver, its edge catching the faint light. The late delivery was a blessing in disguise. It means we have the opportunity for a fresh harvest.
Terror cesse d'Antoine.
He turned to flee, but Pascal was surprisingly fast. The chef moved with a predatory grace, blocking the narrow doorway. Where do you think you're going, Antoine? You've seen too much. And besides, Pascal's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a little too long, a little too sharp. You're just the right size for tonight's special. The last thing Antoine saw was the glint of the cleaver descending, and the hungry, satisfied look in Chef Pascal's obsidian eyes. The metallic tang in the air of Loup Serpent Carrot, it turned out, was not thyme nor roasted garlic. It was the scent of iron, of blood, and of a chef's unholy devotion to his craft. And the lingering aftertaste, it was the taste of fear, cooked slowly, tragically, to perfection. The restaurant continued to thrive. Critics continued to laud Pascal's genius, unaware of the true ingredients that gave his dishes their unique, unforgettable flavor. The new apprentice, a bright-eyed young woman named Cécile, occasionally wondered about the faint, sweet odor in the kitchen. "It's the essence, my dear," Pascal would murmur, his eyes gleaming. "The true essence of Loup Serpent Carrot." The old iron gates of Blackwood Manor groaned a protest as Roth pushed them open, the sound echoing like a dying breath in the twilight. Rain, cold and insistent, plastered his threadbare coat to his frame, and the wind, a mournful banshee, whipped at his face. He adjusted the brim of his hat, his gaze fixed on the sprawling, skeletal silhouette of the manor against the bruised sky. It was a place that seemed to actively repel life, a monument to forgotten sorrows. Roth, a man whose life had been a series of quiet, unremarkable failures, had answered the cryptic advertisement out of desperation. Caretaker required for isolated estate, discretion and fortitude essential, generous remuneration. Generous remuneration was the bait. The isolation and the implied fortitude were the hooks. He was tired of the city, of the relentless noise and the crushing anonymity. Blackwood Manor, for all its foreboding grandeur, promised a different kind of anonymity, one where he might finally disappear, not just from the world, but from the gnawing disappointment of himself. The gravel path crunched under his worn boots, each step a declaration of his arrival into a world he suspected was not entirely his own. The manor loomed closer, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from a skull. Ivy, thick as anaconda coils, strangled its stone walls, and the gables, sharp as broken teeth, clawed at the low-hanging clouds. There was no light, no welcoming flicker, only the deepening gloom and the relentless patter of rain. He found the heavy oak door, studded with rusted iron, and a key, surprisingly, was tucked beneath a loose stone beside it. It was a massive, ornate thing, cold to the touch, and it turned in the lock with a metallic shriek that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The door swung inward, revealing a cavernous darkness that smelled of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Roth stepped inside, the sound of the storm immediately muffled, replaced by an oppressive silence. He fumbled for his torch, its beam cutting a trembling swathe through the inky blackness. The entrance hall was vast, dominated by a grand staircase that spiraled into the upper reaches, swallowed by shadows. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, draped from every chandelier and corner. Furniture, shrouded in white sheets, stood like ghostly sentinels. It was a house frozen in time, waiting. His first task, as outlined in the brief, impersonal letter he'd received, was to ensure the basic systems were functional. The electricity, miraculously, flickered to life after he located the main breaker in a damp, spiderweb-laden cellar. The sudden illumination, though dim, did little to dispel the gloom. Instead, it merely highlighted the pervasive grime and the unsettling stillness of the house. Days bled into weeks, Roth established a routine. He cleaned, he repaired, he explored. Each room was a chapter in a forgotten history, filled with antique furniture, portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, and trinkets that whispered of lives long past. The library, with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, became his sanctuary during the day, though even there, a chill seemed to permeate the air, regardless of the roaring fire he kept in the hearth. He learned the house's rhythms, the creak of settling timbers, the groan of the wind in the chimneys, the drip of a leaky pipe in the east wing. But there were other sounds, too, faint whispers that seemed to Amon drift from empty corridors, the soft thud of something unseen falling upstairs, the distinct, rhythmic tapping that would begin precisely at midnight from the master bedroom. Roth was a man of logic, a pragmatist. He attributed the whispers to the wind, the thud to old pipes, the tapping to some structural anomaly. He told himself these things, but the cold knot in his stomach tightened with each passing night. He started sleeping with a heavy iron poker beside his bed, a foolish gesture, he knew, against something he couldn't see or touch. One evening, while cleaning the drawing room, he found a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the fireplace. Inside, nestled amongst dried potpourri and brittle lace, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with elegant, spidery script. It was a diary belonging to a woman named Elara Blackwood, dated from the late 1800s. He began to read, slowly at first, then with a growing sense of dread. Elara's entries painted a picture of a vibrant, intelligent woman slowly succumbing to an unseen torment within the manor. She spoke of a presence, a coldness that seeped into her bones, of shadows that moved in the periphery of sight. Her descriptions became increasingly frantic, her handwriting more erratic. She wrote of whispers, of being watched, of a growing despair that the house itself was feeding on her. "It wants something," she wrote in one chilling entry. "It feeds on fear, on loneliness. It grows stronger with each passing night. I hear its breath in the walls, its footsteps on the stairs when no one is there. It is waiting." The last entry was terse, almost illegible. "It is here. It is in the room. I cannot escape." Roth closed the journal, his hands trembling. The metallic, sweet smell he'd noticed on his first day seemed stronger now, clinging to the pages. He looked up, his eyes scanning the drawing room, suddenly seeing the shadows not as mere absence of light, but as something sentient, something lurking. The house, which had once felt merely old, now felt alive and malevolent. The tapping from the master bedroom began earlier that night, a relentless, insistent rhythm that seemed to pound directly into his skull. He tried to ignore it, burying his head under his pillow, but it was useless. It was a sound that demanded attention, a summons. He rose, the iron poker clutched in his hand, and ascended the grand staircase. Each step creaked under his weight, amplifying the silence that preceded him. The air grew colder with every floor, a biting chill that made his teeth chatter. The tapping grew louder, clearer, emanating from behind the heavy, carved oak door of the master bedroom. He pushed the door open, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was bathed in moonlight filtering through the tall, uncurtained windows, casting long, distorted shadows. The tapping stopped. The room was opulent, though covered in a thick layer of dust. A four-poster bed, draped in cobwebs, stood in the center. A vanity table with an ornate mirror reflected the ghostly moonlight. And there, by the window, was a rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. Roth's breath caught in his throat. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the tapping had come from that chair. But it was empty. He took a hesitant step inside, his eyes darting around the room. The air was heavy, stagnant, yet he felt a distinct pressure, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on him. He saw it then, in the corner of his eye, a fleeting movement in the mirror. A shadow, deeper than the moonlight could explain, seemed to coalesce behind him. He spun around, poker raised, but there was nothing. Only the empty room, the the swaying chair, and his own ragged breath. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his bed, the poker clutched tight, listening to every creak, every groan of the old house. Sleep was impossible. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if something had not only entered his space but had touched his very soul. The next morning, exhaustion etched on his face. Roth decided he had to leave. The generous remuneration be damned. No amount of money was worth this creeping madness. He would pack his meager belongings and be gone by nightfall. But as he descended the stairs, a new sound reached him. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching, coming from beneath the floorboards of the main hall. It was rhythmic, persistent, like something trying to claw its way out. He knelt, pressing his ear to the cold wood. The scratching intensified, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled back, his eyes wide, looking for an escape. The front door, which he had left ajar, was now firmly shut. He tried the handle. It was locked. He tried to force it open, but it was unyielding, as if the house itself was holding it fast. He was trapped. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and the moaning escalated into a desperate, mournful wail. The air in the hall grew heavy, thick with the metallic, sweet smell. Shadows stretched and writhed on the walls, no longer just absence of light, but living, breathing entities. Roth stumbled backward, tripping over a shrouded piece of furniture. He scrambled to his feet, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep through the cracks, spreading slowly, like an ink blot on parchment. The smell became overpowering, the cloying sweetness of decay and iron. He backed away, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. He had to get out. He ran for the nearest window, a tall, leaded pane in the drawing room. He tried to smash it with the poker, but the glass, ancient and thick, resisted, vibrating with a low hum. The wailing intensified, now seeming to come from all around him, from the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. He could feel a cold breath on his neck, a spectral touch that made him cry out. He turned, and there, standing in the doorway of the drawing room, was a figure. It was a woman, shrouded in a tattered, flowing gown, her face obscured by a veil of darkness. But he could feel her eyes on him, cold and ancient, filled with an unimaginable sorrow and an insatiable hunger. It was Alara, or what was left of her. She raised a translucent hand, beckoning him. The air around her shimmered, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe in anticipation. The scratching from beneath the floorboards reached a fever pitch, and the dark liquid was now pooling rapidly, reflecting the ghostly light from the windows. Roth screamed, a raw, primal sound torn from his throat. He threw the poker at the apparition, but it passed through her, clattering harmlessly to the floor. He turned and ran, blindly, desperately, deeper into the house, seeking any escape from the suffocating presence. He fled up the grand staircase, the wailing echoing behind him, the cold breath of the entity pursuing him. He reached the master bedroom, slamming the door shut, fumbling with the heavy bolt. But as he turned, he saw it. The rocking chair, swaying violently now, was no longer empty. A faint, shimmering outline of a figure sat in it, its head bowed, its form indistinct, but the tapping was back, louder than ever, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He backed away, pressing himself against the far wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was filled with an unbearable cold, a cold that seemed to penetrate his very bones. The spectral figure in the chair slowly raised its head. Two pinpricks of light, like distant, dying stars, glowed within the shadowy face. And then, a voice, a dry, rustling whisper, filled the room, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. You are here to stay, Roth, just like the others, just like Alara. This house, it needs a caretaker. It needs sustenance. The words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. He understood now. The generous remuneration, the isolation, the need for fortitude. It wasn't about protecting the house. It was about feeding it. He was not a caretaker, he was the next meal. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming long, grasping tendrils that reached for him. The cold intensified, a suffocating embrace that stole his breath. He felt a profound weariness, an overwhelming desire to simply give in, to let the darkness consume him. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he heard, before the silence claimed him, was the rhythmic, relentless tapping of the rocking chair, a macabre lullaby for the newest resident of Blackwood Manor. The rain continued to fall, washing the old iron gates, the gravel path, and the stone walls of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the house settled back into its oppressive silence, waiting. The rocking chair in the master bedroom continued its gentle sway, and from deep within the foundations, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching began anew, a promise of the hunger that still resided within the walls. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, a new, faint whisper joined the chorus of the forgotten. Timothy Sterling, a man whose name echoed with the clink of old money and the rustle of silk, lived in a mansion that was less a home and more a monument to his family's enduring wealth. Sterling Manor, a Gothic revival behemoth perched atop a windswept bluff overlooking the churning Atlantic, had seen generations of Sterlings come and go, each adding their layer of opulence and, perhaps, a whisper of their own particular madness. Tim, the latest inheritor of this grand, chilling legacy, found himself increasingly adrift within its cavernous halls. He was a man of precise habits and meticulous order. His days were a symphony of scheduled meetings, market analyses, and philanthropic gestures that served more to polish his public image than to genuinely aid the less fortunate. Yet, beneath this veneer of control, a subtle tremor had begun to ripple through his carefully constructed world. It started innocently enough. A misplaced antique, a faint, inexplicable chill in a usually warm room, the fleeting scent of something ancient and metallic, like old blood and rust, in the air. His staff, a retinue of discreet, long-serving individuals, noticed his growing unease. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose face was a roadmap of Sterling family secrets, would eye him with a knowing, almost pitying gaze. John, the stoic butler, moved with an even greater quietness, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that clung to the manor like a shroud. The catalyst for Tim's descent into genuine fear was the heirloom. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a grim-faced courier who spoke in clipped tones of unforeseen circumstances and final bequests. It was a box, intricately carved from what appeared to be obsidian, its surface cool and slick to the touch, absorbing all light. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single unadorned silver locket. It was tarnished with age, and when Tim prized it open, he found it empty. No faded photograph, no lock of hair, just a void. A note accompanied the box, written in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. To Timothy, the last of the line. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. There was no signature. Tim, a man of logic and reason, dismissed it as a morbid prank, perhaps from a distant, disgruntled relative. He placed the locket and the obsidian box on his study desk, intending to have John dispose of them later. But he didn't. Something about the box, its impenetrable darkness, its cold weight, compelled him. That night, the manor truly began to stir. He was awoken by a sound, subtle at first, like the whisper of silk across polished floors. He sat up in his vast, four-poster bed, his heart thrumming. The sound grew, becoming a distinct, rhythmic dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the marble tiles of the grand hall below. He reached for the ornate silver bell on his bedside table, intending to summon John, but his hand froze. The sound was coming from inside his room. A shadow, deeper than the moonless night outside, detached itself from the corner of his chamber. It was formless, yet possessed a palpable presence, a weight that pressed down on the air. A cold, metallic scent, stronger now, filled his nostrils. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His breath hitched in his throat. The shadow drifted towards his desk, towards the obsidian box. It hovered there for a moment, and then, with an almost imperceptible shift, it seemed to absorb the darkness of the box, making it even blacker, even more absolute. A faint, high-pitched keening sound, like wind through a tomb, emanated from the shadow. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it receded, melting back into the shadows of the room. The dragging sound faded. Tim was left trembling, bathed in a cold sweat, the metallic scent lingering like a phantom. The next morning, he found the locket open on his desk, its empty interior glinting faintly in the morning light. He was certain he had closed it. He tried to rationalize it. Sleep deprivation, stress, the old house playing tricks on him. But the metallic scent, the palpable cold, the feeling of an unseen presence, these were not figments of his imagination. He began to research. The Sterling family history was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, power, and a surprising number of unexplained disappearances and sudden, violent deaths. He delved into dusty archives in the manor's forgotten library, poring over brittle journals and faded letters. He discovered mentions of a Sterling curse, a whispered legend about a pact made by an ancestor, Elias Sterling, in the 17th century, a pact for immense wealth and influence at an unspeakable cost. The journal spoke of the Collector, a shadowy entity that Elias had supposedly bound to the family line. It was said to collect payments from each generation, not in gold or land, but in something far more precious. The journals became increasingly frantic, their authors descending into madness, their final entries scrawled in desperate, illegible script, hinting at a final reckoning. One journal, belonging to his great-great-grandfather, Alistair Sterling, contained a chilling passage. The locket, it is the key, not to open but to contain. It must be filled. It must be fed. Tim felt a cold dread seep into his bones. What was to be fed? And with what? The manifestations grew bolder. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed shut when no one was near. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. A fleeting shadow, a flicker of something dark and slender. The metallic scent was now omnipresent, clinging to the very fabric of the manor. One evening, as he sat in the study, the locket on his desk began to vibrate. A low hum filled the room, growing in intensity. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light. Then, from its empty interior, a faint, silvery mist began to curl outwards, coalescing into a spectral, skeletal hand. It reached out, its long, bony fingers trembling, as if searching for something. Tim scrambled back, overturning his chair. The hand retracted, and the mist dissipated, leaving the locket still and empty once more. He knew then that he couldn't ignore it. The heirloom was not a prank. It was a conduit, and the Collector was not a legend. It was real. He confronted Mrs. Gable. Her face, usually so composed, paled when he mentioned the obsidian box and the locket. "It's the Sterling's bane, Mr. Timothy," she whispered, her voice raspy with fear. "My grandmother worked here, and her grandmother before her. They all knew. The Collector comes for what's owed." "What's owed, Mrs. Gable?" Tim demanded, his voice tight. She wrung her hands. "Life, Mr. Timothy. Life. It feeds on the essence, the spirit. That's why the locket is empty. It's meant to be filled." The realization hit Tim with the force of a physical blow. The disappearances, the madness, the sudden deaths. The Collector wasn't taking gold. It was taking souls, and the locket was its vessel. He understood the note now. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. The locket didn't open to reveal something. It opened to receive something. And what was locked away was the very essence of life, trapped within the Sterling line. Tim was a man of immense wealth, but suddenly he felt utterly impoverished. His money, his power, his influence, none of it could protect him from this ancient, insatiable hunger. He spent days and nights researching, growing gaunt, his eyes hollowed by lack of sleep. He found a cryptic passage in Alistair's journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the library. It detailed a ritual, a desperate attempt to appease the collector, to satiate its hunger with a substitute offering. Alistair had failed, driven mad by the attempt. But the ritual described a way to temporarily bind the entity, to force it back into its slumber. The ritual required a sacrifice. Not a human one, Alistair had emphasized, but something of immense personal value, imbued with a powerful emotional connection. And it had to be offered at the precise moment of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The winter solstice was 3 days away. Tim looked around his opulent prison. What did he possess that held immense personal value? He had never truly loved anything but his own comfort and control. His wealth was a means, not an end. His possessions were status symbols, not cherished memories. Then he remembered. His grandfather, a man he had genuinely admired, had given him a small, unassuming pocket watch when he was a boy. It was not valuable in monetary terms, but it was the only thing he possessed that carried a true emotional weight, a connection to a simpler, happier time. It was the only thing that wasn't tainted by the sterling legacy of greed and darkness. The manor became a battleground. The collector, sensing his intent, intensified its attacks. Whispers echoed from empty rooms, chilling him to the bone. Apparitions, fleeting and grotesque, flickered in the corners of his vision. He would wake to find himself paralyzed, a crushing weight on his chest, the metallic scent suffocating him. He saw shadows coalesce into figures, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, their mouths opening in silent screams. He barricaded himself in the library, the only room where he felt a semblance of safety, surrounded by the knowledge of his ancestors' folly. He meticulously prepared for the ritual, gathering the obscure herbs, the arcane symbols, the ancient incantations described in Alistair's journal. On the night of the solstice, a blizzard raged outside, mirroring the storm within Stirling Manor. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the ancient windows. The power flickered, plunging the manor into darkness, then restoring it with a jarring surge. Tim stood in the center of the library, the pocket watch clutched in his hand. The locket lay open on a makeshift altar, surrounded by flickering candles. The metallic scent was overwhelming, thick and cloying. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The shadow appeared, larger and more defined than ever before. It filled the room, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, its presence a suffocating weight. From its depths, 2 pinpricks of crimson light flared, like malevolent eyes. A voice, ancient and guttural, echoed in his mind, not heard with his ears, but felt in his very bones. "You seek to deny me what is mine, Stirling. The debt is due." Tim, despite his terror, stood firm. He began to chant the incantations, his voice trembling but resolute. The shadow recoiled slightly, a ripple passing through its form. He placed the pocket watch into the empty locket. As it settled, a blinding flash of light erupted from the locket, followed by a deafening shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The crimson eyes of the shadow widened, and it began to writhe, its form flickering. The locket glowed with an intense, pure light, pushing back the encroaching darkness. The metallic scent began to fade, replaced by the faint, comforting aroma of old wood and dust. The shadow, with one final, desperate lunge, tried to reclaim the locket. But the light held, a barrier of pure, unyielding energy. With a final, ear-splitting wail, the shadow was sucked back into the locket, which snapped shut with an audible click. The light faded. The metallic scent vanished. The storm outside began to subside. Tim stood there, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The locket lay on the altar, no longer glowing, no longer radiating cold. It was just a tarnished silver locket, now containing the pocket watch. He picked it up, felt warm, and for the first time, not ominous. The silence in the manor was profound, a blessed absence of the unseen horrors that had plagued him. He had won. He had broken the Stirling curse. or so he thought. Days turned into weeks. The manor felt different, lighter. The staff noticed it too. Mrs. Gable even smiled, a rare and genuine expression. Tim began to sleep soundly, the nightmares banished. He even started to consider selling the manor, starting anew. But then the dreams began. They were vivid, unsettling. He would find himself in a vast, empty void, the only sound the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock. And in the distance, a tiny crimson light would flicker, growing steadily brighter. He dismissed them as residual stress. But the dreams grew more intense, more real. He would wake up feeling drained, as if something had been siphoned from him during the night. One morning, he noticed a faint, metallic scent in his room. Just a hint, almost imperceptible. He tried to ignore it. Then the locket. He had placed it in a locked safe deep within his study. But one morning, he found it on his bedside table, open, and the pocket watch was gone. His blood ran cold. He rushed to the safe. It was still locked, undisturbed. He checked his pockets, his drawers. The pocket watch was nowhere to be found. He remembered Alistair's journal. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. And the collector's voice. You seek to deny me what is mine. The collector hadn't been banished. It had been trapped. And the locket, the vessel, was now empty once more. The metallic scent grew stronger. The subtle chills returned. He began to hear the faint, rhythmic dragging sound again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the grand hall. It was coming from inside his own mind. He saw it then in the reflection of the antique mirror in his study. Not a shadow, not a formless void, but a faint, shimmering outline within his own reflection. It was a skeletal hand, reaching out from within him, its fingers twitching, its grasp tightening. The collector hadn't wanted the pocket watch. It had wanted the vessel to be empty. It had wanted the locket to be free to collect again. And what was the most valuable thing he possessed now? The thing imbued with the most powerful emotional connection. The thing he had used to break the curse. His own life. His own essence. The sterling curse wasn't about a debt to be paid. It was about a hunger that could never be truly satisfied. It was about a collector that, once bound, would always seek to fill its empty vessel, generation after generation, until there was nothing left. Timothy Sterling, the last of his line, looked into the mirror and saw the crimson pinpricks of light begin to flare in his own eyes. The metallic scent filled his lungs, and he felt a cold, crushing weight begin to settle over his heart. The ticking sound in his mind grew louder, faster, counting down the final moments of the Sterling legacy. The locket was empty, and it was waiting to be filled. The last sliver of sun, a bruised purple, bled into the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of dying fire and bruised plums. It left Kalen and his horse, a sturdy mare named Willow, to the mercy of the encroaching twilight, a twilight that felt less like a gentle descent into night and more like a predatory closing of jaws. Kalen shivered, pulling his worn, threadbare cloak tighter, the course while doing little to ward off the creeping dread that had begun to settle deep in his bones. A cold seep that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath Willow's hooves. It wasn't just the sharp, biting chill of the late autumn evening that pricked his skin. It was the profound, unsettling quiet of the ancient, primeval forest they now traversed. Every rustle of dry leaves under Willow's hooves, every snap of a twig, every distant hoot of an owl seemed amplified, cutting through the unnatural stillness, making his own shallow, ragged breaths sound thunderous in his ears, a frantic counterpoint to the silence. He was bound for the Temple of the Whispering Stones, a place of pilgrimage and some whispered, forgotten, terrible power nestled deep within the treacherous, mist-shrouded Blackwood marshes. His younger sister, Ilara, lay wasting, consumed by a fever that had defied every poultice, every bitter draught, and every desperate prayer offered by the village healer. Her skin was hot to the touch, dry and cracked, her breath shallow and rasping, and her eyes, once bright with youthful mischief and a spark of defiance, were now clouded with pain and a growing, terrifying dimness that Kalen couldn't bear to witness. Desperate, with hope dwindling like a dying ember in a cold hearth, Kalen had remembered the old tales, the ones his grandmother, a woman steeped in the village's forgotten lore and ancient superstitions, used to tell in hushed tones by the fire. Tales of the temple's ability to grant miracles, to mend what was broken, to pull souls back from the very precipice of death, if one dared to ask, and if the price, unspoken but implicitly understood, was right. The journey was long, perilous, and, as the oppressive darkness deepened with every passing moment, increasingly foreboding, each step taking him further from the familiar world and deeper into the unknown. Willow, usually spirited and sure-footed, her ears constantly pricked, seemed to share his profound apprehension. Her ears twitched constantly, swiveling back and forth, picking up sounds Kalen couldn't hear, sounds that existed just beyond the range of human perception. She snorted, a low, nervous sound, occasionally shying violently at shadows that Kalen could not discern, phantom shapes that seemed to writhe and contort just beyond the edge of his vision, like half-formed nightmares. He patted her sweating neck, murmuring reassurances, his voice a strained whisper, but his own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence, a desperate plea for escape. The path, once a clear if overgrown trail used by occasional trappers or the truly desperate, had narrowed to little more than a deer track, swallowed by gnarled skeletal trees whose branches, devoid of leaves, clawed at the fading sky like skeletal fingers, grasping for something unseen, something just out of reach. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, congealed blood, a smell that made his stomach churn and his gorge rise. Kalen strained his eyes, peering into the gloom, trying to pierce the oppressive darkness. The forest canopy was so dense here that even the meager starlight struggled to penetrate, leaving them in a suffocating, inky blackness that pressed in from all sides, a tangible weight. He fumbled for the lantern hanging from his saddle, his fingers clumsy with cold and the tremor of fear that ran through him. Its feeble glow, a sickly yellow, did little more than push back the immediate darkness, creating a small, trembling circle of light that only served to make the surrounding shadows seem even deeper, more menacing, and filled with unseen, lurking things that seemed to watch from the periphery. A sound, faint at first, then growing steadily, reached his ears, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them, resonating in his bones. It was a low, mournful keening, like the wind wailing through a hollow bone, or the endless, despairing cry of a soul in eternal torment. Willow whinnied, a sharp, terrified sound that tore through the silence like a knife, and tried to bolt, rearing violently on her hind legs, her hooves scrabbling desperately at the slick earth, desperate to escape. Kalen wrestled with the reins, his muscles straining, his knuckles white with the effort. "Easy, girl, easy," he grunted, fighting to control her, his voice hoarse with effort and fear, barely audible above the rising wail. The keening intensified, seeming to swirl around them, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. A disembodied lament that spoke of ancient sorrow, of unbearable loss, of a grief so profound it had become a physical entity, a palpable presence. It chilled Kalen to the bone, seeping into his marrow, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He urged Willow forward, desperate to escape the sound, to reach the temple before whatever made that noise found them, before it could drag them into its endless despair. The path became slick underfoot, the soil giving way to a muddy slush, and the marshy ground began to squelch with each step, sucking at Willow's hooves with a sickening, slurping sound. The trees thinned slightly, their skeletal forms replaced by a dense thicket of tall, whispering reeds and stagnant pools that reflected the bruised, dying sky like dead, unblinking eyes, mirroring the growing terror in Kalen's own. The keening faded, replaced by the guttural croaking of unseen frogs and the incessant, maddening buzzing of unseen insects, a sound that grated on his already frayed nerves. But the oppressive feeling remained, a cold, unseen hand gripping his heart, squeezing the last vestiges of hope from him. Then he saw them, flickering lights, like distant, malevolent fireflies, danced among the reeds ahead, moving with an unnatural, almost intelligent rhythm. Not fireflies, he realized with a jolt of pure dread that shot through him like ice, freezing his blood. These lights were too large, too steady, too deliberate in their movement. They were like eyes watching, observing, waiting. Kalen pulled Willow to a shuddering halt, her body trembling violently beneath him. His breath hitched in his throat, a painful lump. He could feel a prickling sensation on his neck, the undeniable, visceral feeling of being observed, of being hunted, of being nothing more than prey. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice a reedy whisper, thin and pathetic, swallowed instantly by the vast, hungry silence of the marsh. Only the croaking frogs answered, their chorus sounding mocking, indifferent to his plight. The lights continued their macabre dance, drawing closer with agonizing slowness, resolving into faint, ethereal glows that seemed to hover just above the marsh water, reflecting in its dark surface like drowned stars or the souls of the lost. He could almost make out shapes behind them, indistinct, wavering forms that seemed to shift and coalesce in the gloom, like smoke given malevolent purpose or shadows detached from their source. They were not human. They were not animal. They were something else entirely, something ancient and terrible. Willow began to tremble violently beneath him, her whole body shaking, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. A thin line of foam appeared on her lips, and her eyes rolled wildly. Kalen knew they couldn't stay. To remain was to invite whatever those lights represented to claim them, to drag them down into the cold, dark depths of the marsh. He spurred her on, forcing her through the thick, grasping reeds, away from the dancing lights, away from the unseen watchers. The marsh water splashed around them, cold and dark, smelling of rot and decay, and a faint, sickly sweet odor that made his stomach clench. He could feel unseen things brushing against his legs, slippery and cold, perhaps reeds, perhaps something else entirely, something that lived beneath the surface. He didn't dare look down, terrified of what his lantern might reveal lurking beneath the murky surface, what horrors might be waiting to pull him under. The ground gradually firmed, and the reeds gave way to stunted, twisted trees, their branches draped with long gray moss that swayed like spectral shrouds in the imperceptible breeze, giving the forest a haunted, desolate appearance. The air grew colder, a biting cold that seemed to drain the warmth from his very bones, making his muscles ache, and the metallic, sweet scent became stronger, almost overwhelming, making him gag, forcing him to cover his mouth with his cloak. Kalen clutched the amulet around his neck, a small, worn wooden carving of a protective deity, its smooth surface offering little comfort, feeling cold against his clammy skin. He hoped it offered some ward against the unseen horrors of this place, against the things that lurked just beyond the veil of perception, waiting to snatch him away. He saw it then, through a sudden, unexpected break in the trees, a stark, imposing silhouette against the barely visible horizon, framed by the skeletal branches. The temple. It wasn't the majestic, welcoming structure he had imagined from the comforting tales of his grandmother, a place of light and healing. Instead, it was a squat, ancient edifice built of dark, rough-hewn stone, its roof partially collapsed, its walls scarred by centuries of wind and rain, and perhaps something far more sinister, something that had actively sought to defile it. It looked less like a place of worship and more like a tomb. No, worse than a tomb, a forgotten, festering wound upon the earth, a place where light and life had long since given way to shadow and decay, where only death could thrive. There was no welcoming light, no sign of life, no hint of pilgrimage or solace, only the gaping maw of its entrance, a black void that seemed to swallow the last vestiges of twilight, pulling them into its depths, promising only oblivion. A single, broken bell tower stood sentinel, leaning precariously, its cracked bell hanging silent, a testament to long-dead rituals, to screams unheard, to prayers unanswered, to a time when this place might have been different. As they drew closer, the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of a place where even the wind held its breath, where sound itself feared to tread, where the very air seemed to absorb all noise, leaving only an oppressive void. Willow stopped dead, refusing to go further, her eyes wide with terror, rolling wildly in their sockets, and she snorted, pawing frantically at the ground, a desperate plea to turn back, to flee this cursed place. Kalen dismounted, his legs stiff and aching, his body trembling uncontrollably, a tremor that started in his knees and shook him to his core. "Stay here, girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible, though he doubted she would move an inch from this spot, rooted by fear, by an instinct far older than his own. He knew he had to go on alone. Alara's life depended on it, or so he desperately hoped. He approached the temple entrance on foot, his lantern held high, its feeble beam swallowed by the absolute darkness within, a darkness that seemed to actively resist the light. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something ancient and cloying, like dust mixed with decay, a smell that spoke of things long dead and things that refused to die, things that lingered. The walls of the entrance were covered in carvings, eroded by centuries of wind and rain, but he could still make out grotesque figures. Multi-limbed beings with vacant, staring eyes, their faces twisted in silent agony or malevolent glee. Serpents entwined around crumbling pillars, their scales etched with disturbing patterns, and symbols he did not recognize, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering, uncertain light of his lantern, as if they were alive, watching him. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow, making his teeth ache and his muscles seize. The floor was uneven, strewn with rubble and a fine, powdery layer of dust that rose with each step, stinging his nostrils, making him cough. The silence here was absolute, pressing in on him, making his ears ring, a deafening absence of sound that screamed of emptiness and despair. He could hear the frantic beat of his own heart, loud and frantic in the oppressive stillness, a frantic drum against the silence, a desperate protest against the inevitable. The main chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, an abyss above him, swallowing the light. Crumbling pillars, carved with the same unsettling figures, rose into the darkness, disappearing into the blackness like ancient, petrified trees, their forms indistinct in the gloom. In the center stood a raised altar, also of dark, rough-hewn stone, its surface stained with what looked like ancient, dried blood, a dark, crusty residue that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, almost glowing with a malevolent energy. Kalen felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, overwhelming urge to vomit, to expel the horror that was filling him. This was no place of healing. This was a place of sacrifice, a place where life was taken, not given, where hope came to die. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching on the debris, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vast space, each step a betrayal of his own instincts. His lantern beam danced across the walls, revealing more carvings, more unsettling symbols, images that seemed to twist his stomach into knots, to burrow into his mind. He noticed something peculiar about the shadows cast by his light. They seemed to move independently, to stretch and contort in ways that defied the laws of physics, like living things lurking just beyond the edge of his vision, just out of sight, always shifting, always watching, always waiting. A faint scratching sound echoed from deeper within the temple, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to come from behind the altar, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand on end and sent a shiver down his spine. Kalen froze, his hand instinctively going to the small, rusty dagger at his belt, its hilt cold and rough against his palm, offering little comfort. He was no warrior, just a simple farmer, but he would not go down without a fight, not after coming all this way, not with Alara's life hanging by such a fragile thread. He crept towards the altar, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, threatening to burst. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like something trying to claw its way out of the very stone, something desperate to be free, to escape its ancient prison. He rounded the altar, his lantern beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the wall directly behind it. What he saw made him gasp, a strangled sound that died in his throat, swallowed by the suffocating silence, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. There, embedded in the wall behind the altar, was a large circular stone, covered in the same unsettling carvings he had seen at the entrance, the symbols now seeming to pulse with a faint, inner light. And from a jagged crack in its center, a thin, skeletal hand, impossibly long and bony, was slowly, painstakingly emerging. Its fingers twitched, flexing, as if testing the air, as if tasting the despair that filled the chamber, the fear that emanated from Kalen. The scratching sound was the fingernails, long and yellowed, sharp as talons, scraping against the ancient stone as it tried to pull itself free, inch by agonizing inch, a slow, horrifying birth. It was trying to escape, and he had been foolish enough to be here when it did. A low, guttural whisper, dry as parchment, slithered into his mind, not through his ears, but directly into his thoughts, bypassing all his senses, burrowing into his very consciousness, filling it with dread. "Youth have come at last. The offering is here." The words were ancient, filled with a terrible, patient hunger, a hunger that had waited for centuries. Kalen stumbled backward, tripping over a piece of rubble, his feet tangling, dropping his lantern. It clattered to the floor, its light flickering wildly, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the walls before dying with a soft hiss, plunging the entire chamber into absolute, impenetrable darkness. He was blind, utterly blind, trapped in the suffocating blackness with whatever horror was emerging from the wall, with whatever ancient evil had spoken to him, with whatever had been waiting. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him, a physical weight, broken only by Kalen's ragged, desperate breathing, each gasp a desperate plea for air. He could feel a presence in the room now, closer, colder, heavier than before, a vast, malevolent entity that filled the space around him, its unseen form radiating an unimaginable evil. He could almost taste the decay in the air, a cloying sweetness that made him want to retch, to empty his stomach of its contents. He heard a soft, wet slithering sound, like something immense dragging itself across the stone floor, something heavy and slick, something with too many limbs. It was coming for him. He scrambled backward, his hands flailing in the darkness, bumping into a crumbling pillar, his hands scrabbling against the rough, cold stone, desperate for purchase. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him, paralyzing him for a moment before igniting a desperate, primal urge to flee, to escape this nightmare. He had to get out. He had to escape this place. He pushed himself up, blindly stumbling towards where he thought the entrance was, his arms outstretched, bumping into unseen obstacles, bruising himself in the process. The slithering sound pursued him, growing faster, closer, like a predator closing in on its prey, its movements chillingly deliberate. He could hear a faint clicking now, like bone on stone, and a shallow, rasping breath, wet and guttural, right behind him, so close he could feel the cold air on his neck. Suddenly, his foot caught on something, and he pitched forward, falling hard to the ground, his head hitting the stone with a sickening thud that sent stars exploding behind his eyes. He cried out, a pathetic whimper, the sound swallowed by the darkness. As he lay there, disoriented, his vision swimming, a cold, dry hand, impossibly large, closed around his ankle, its grip like iron. It was impossibly strong, far stronger than any human. He screamed, a raw, animalistic sound, thrashing wildly, trying to kick free, but the grip tightened, like a vice made of iron and bone. He felt long, sharp nails like talons, digging into his flesh, piercing his skin, drawing blood, a warm, sticky sensation. The thing began to drag him, slowly, inexorably, across the rough floor, back towards the altar, back towards the source of the evil, back towards his doom. Eng Monk had always been a seeker, not for wealth nor fame, nor even conventional happiness. Eng sought truth. He believed, with an almost religious fervor, that beneath the mundane veil of everyday existence lay a profound, terrifying, and ultimately liberating reality. He called it gnosis, a direct, intuitive apprehension of spiritual truths, a knowledge that transcended mere intellect. For years, his apartment, a cluttered sanctuary of esoteric texts and flickering candles, had been his crucible. He devoured forgotten grimoires, ancient philosophical treatises, and whispered legends of hidden orders. His diet was sparse, his sleep fragmented, his social life non-existent, all sacrificed at the altar of ultimate understanding. The path, he discovered, was not through dogma or ritual alone, but through a radical stripping away of the self, a deliberate shattering of the ego's illusions. He began with prolonged meditation, hours spent in silent darkness, pushing past the chattering mind, the physical discomfort, the gnawing doubts. He experimented with sensory deprivation, sitting for days in a lightless, soundproof chamber he'd painstakingly constructed in his spare room, the air thick with the scent of ozone and stale incense. He fasted until his body trembled, until the world seemed to shimmer at the edges of his vision, until the very concept of hunger became an abstract hum. The first breakthroughs were subtle, almost imperceptible, a heightened clarity in his thoughts, a sudden, profound understanding of a complex philosophical concept that had previously eluded him. Colors seemed richer, sounds more nuanced. He could almost feel the vibrations of the city outside his window, a vast, intricate symphony of life and decay. He dismissed these as mere psychological effects, the brain compensating for deprivation. But then came the dreams. They weren't dreams in the conventional sense. They were lucid, hyper-real experiences, often involving vast, geometric landscapes that shifted and reformed with impossible logic. He met figures there, not people but archetypes, beings of pure concept, their faces unformed, their voices resonating directly into his consciousness without sound. They spoke in riddles, in paradoxes, in truths that simultaneously illuminated and terrified. One recurring entity, a towering silhouette wreathed in shadow, its form constantly dissolving and reforming like smoke, would simply point at nothing, point at everything, and Aang would feel an unbearable pressure in his skull, a sensation of being stretched thin across an infinite void. He knew he was close. The fear, a cold, creeping dread, was a constant companion now. It wasn't the fear of death, but the fear of unbeing, of dissolving into the very fabric of the reality he sought to grasp. He pressed on. The final push came during a week-long vigil, fueled only by sips of water and the burning intensity of his will. He sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes open, staring at a blank wall. He chanted ancient mantras, not for their meaning, but for the rhythmic vibration they created within him, a resonance that seemed to loosen the very bonds of his perception. Hours bled into days. His body became a distant, irrelevant thing. His thoughts, once a tumultuous river, slowed to a trickle, then ceased altogether. And then it happened. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a gradual unfolding, like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing its roots, its soil, the very geological strata beneath it. The blank wall before him began to ripple, not visually but ontologically. He didn't see cracks. He felt the fissures in its existence. The atoms, the molecules, the very subatomic particles that composed it seemed to hum with an unbearable energy, a silent scream of being. He saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something that had been dormant within him, now violently awakened. He saw the threads. Reality, as he had known it, was a tapestry, a beautiful, intricate, meticulously woven tapestry. But now Aang saw the individual threads, millions upon millions of them, stretching out into an infinite, unknowable darkness. Each thread was a concept, a possibility, a fragment of being. Love, hate, joy, despair, time, space, causality, memory, identity. All were threads, woven together to create the illusion of solidity, of order. And he saw the weavers. They were not beings of flesh and blood, nor even of light and shadow. They were principles.
Formless, vast, indifferent.
They moved among the threads, plucking, weaving, cutting, tying knots. They were the architects of reality, and their work was ceaseless, without purpose beyond the act of weaving itself. Their movements created the laws of physics, the flow of time, the very illusion of free will. Aang felt a surge of ecstatic terror. This was it. This was Gnosis, the unvarnished, horrifying truth. He was seeing behind the curtain, witnessing the cosmic machinery in its raw, unadorned state. The beauty was in its terrible indifference, its utter lack of human concern. But then the horror deepened. He saw the flaws. The tapestry wasn't perfect. There were frayed edges, loose threads, knots that had come undone. And through these imperfections, something else was seeping in. Something that was not part of the weave. It was a coldness, a silence that devoured sound, a darkness that absorbed light. It was the anti-pattern, the unthread. It was what existed between the threads, in the gaps, in the unraveling. And it was vast, infinitely vast. He felt its presence not as a physical sensation, but as a violation of his very being. It was the cosmic static, the background noise of non-existence. And it was hungry. The entities he had seen in his dreams, the shadowy figures, now appeared before him, no longer archetypes but extensions of this unraveling. Their forms were less defined, more chaotic. They were the fraying edges, the loose ends, the forgotten possibilities. They were the things that slipped through the cracks. One of them, the towering silhouette, now stood directly before him, its form a swirling vortex of nothingness. It didn't speak, but its presence resonated with a single, terrifying truth. You are a thread. Aang felt his own thread. He saw it, a thin, shimmering strand, woven into the tapestry of his life, his memories, his identity. And he saw the shadowy entity reach for it. Panic, raw and primal, erupted within him, shattering the serene detachment of Gnosis. He tried to move, to scream, to break free, but his physical body was still rigid, paralyzed by the overwhelming force of his perception. He was trapped, a single thread caught in the cosmic loom. The entity's touch was not a physical one, but a conceptual one. It was the sensation of his memories being unspooled, his experiences unraveling, his very sense of self dissolving. He saw his childhood, his parents, his first love, his triumphs and failures, all becoming loose threads, drifting away into the vast, devouring darkness. He saw other threads, millions of them, each a human life, a consciousness, a universe of experience. And he saw the unthreads consuming them, one by one, silently, relentlessly. They weren't being destroyed. They were being unwoven, their existence erased from the tapestry. The silence grew louder, a roaring void that threatened to swallow everything. The coldness intensified, not the chill of winter, but the absolute zero of non-being. He was falling, not through space, but through the very fabric of reality, as his thread loosened its grip. He saw the weavers, still at their work, seemingly oblivious to the unraveling, or perhaps utterly indifferent to it. Their focus was on the weaving, not on the fate of individual threads. They were the process, not the purpose. A desperate, primal scream tore through his mind, though no sound escaped his lips. He fought against the unraveling, clinging to the last vestiges of his identity, the last few memories that still pulsed with a faint light. He remembered his quest, his burning desire for truth, and a terrible irony struck him. He had found it, and it was consuming him. He saw the faces of those he had loved, their threads still vibrant in the tapestry, unaware of the cosmic horror that lurked beneath their perceived reality. A wave of profound sorrow washed over him, not for himself, but for their blissful ignorance, their fragile, beautiful illusions. The shadowy entity tightened its grip on his thread. He felt his name, Aang Monk, losing its meaning, becoming just a sequence of sounds, devoid of the person it represented. His fear was no longer for his life, but for the obliteration of his consciousness, the erasure of his very existence from the cosmic record. He was becoming one with the unthread, a part of the devouring silence. The geometric landscapes of his dreams returned, but now they were twisted, broken, their impossible angles reflecting the shattered fragments of his mind. The archetypal beings were no longer enigmatic. They were the faces of the void, their silent voices echoing the truth of his impending dissolution. Just as the last thread of his identity seemed about to snap, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of light appeared in the vast darkness. It was a single, tiny thread, unlike any he had seen before. It wasn't woven into the tapestry. It seemed to exist outside it, a defiant spark in the face of the overwhelming void. And then a sound, not a voice, but a vibration, a frequency that resonated with the deepest part of his being, a part that the unraveling had not yet touched. It was a sound of immense, ancient power, a hum that seemed to push back against the consuming silence. The shadowy entity recoiled, its form momentarily distorted, as if struck by an invisible force. The grip on Aang's thread loosened, just enough. With a desperate, final surge of will, Aang pulled. He pulled against the unthread, against the consuming darkness, against the very nature of the gnosis that had brought him to this precipice. He didn't know what he was pulling towards, only that it was away from the abyss. The journey back was a blur of fragmented sensations. The threads of reality rewove themselves around him, his memories rushing back, his identity reforming. The silence receded, replaced by the mundane sounds of his apartment. The distant hum of traffic, the creak of the floorboards, the frantic beat of his own heart. He gasped, a ragged, choking sound, as his eyes snapped open. He was still sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the blank wall. But it wasn't blank anymore. It was just a wall, solid, unremarkable, utterly, blessedly mundane. His body ached, his throat was raw, and a cold sweat plastered his clothes to his skin. He felt a profound exhaustion, as if he had run a marathon across galaxies. He tried to stand, his legs trembling, and collapsed back onto the floor. He was alive. He was whole. But he was changed. The gnosis had left its mark. He still saw the world differently, though not with the terrifying clarity of before. The colors were still richer, the sounds more nuanced, but now there was a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer at the edges of everything. He knew with an absolute certainty that beneath the surface, the threads still hummed, the weavers still worked, and the unthreads still lurked in the spaces between. He looked around his apartment, at the stacks of esoteric books, the flickering candles, the soundproof chamber. They no longer held any allure. The quest was over. He had found the truth, and it had nearly destroyed him. He spent the next few days in a daze, eating sparingly, sleeping fitfully, the echoes of the void still reverberating in his mind. He knew he could never go back to his old life, to his old understanding. The veil had been lifted, and though it had fallen back into place, it was now translucent. One evening, he sat by his window, watching the city lights twinkle like fallen stars. He saw the people below, rushing about their lives, caught in their own intricate weaves of joy and sorrow, love and loss. And he felt a strange, detached pity for them, for their beautiful, necessary illusions. He was no longer a seeker. He was a survivor. He had glimpsed the abyss, and the abyss had glimpsed him. And now, he carried its silent, cold truth within him, a chilling reminder of the fragile, temporary nature of all existence. The gnosis had not brought him enlightenment, but a profound and terrifying solitude. He was awake, and the world was still asleep, and that, he realized, was the most terrifying truth of all. He was alone with the knowledge of the unraveling, forever haunted by the silent scream of the threads and the hungry whisper of the void. And he knew with a chilling certainty that one day the unthreads would find him again. They were patient, they were eternal, and they were always, always hungry. The old house stood on a bluff overlooking the churning, slate-gray waters of the North Atlantic. It wasn't just old. It was ancient, its timbers groaning under the weight of centuries, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless horizon. Locals called it Blackwood Manor, though no one had lived there for 50 years. Not since the disappearances. Dr. Silas Croft, A man whose life had been a series of calculated risks and academic pursuits saw it as the ultimate challenge. A reclusive folklorist, he was obsessed with the liminal spaces where history bled into myth. Blackwood Manor, with its chilling local legends of vanishing families and spectral whispers carried on the sea wind, was his white whale. He'd secured a temporary permit from the distant, indifferent historical society, packed his recording equipment, notebooks, and a healthy dose of skepticism, and arrived on a Tuesday in late October. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, a bracing, melancholic perfume. The drive up the winding, overgrown lane was a tunnel of gnarled trees, their branches skeletal fingers against the bruised sky. As he stepped out of his battered Land Rover, the silence was profound, broken only by the distant roar of the ocean and the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. The house loomed, a monolithic shadow against the fading light. Its clabbered siding was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the porch sagged precariously. Inside, the air was colder, heavier. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. Every surface was coated in a thick layer of grime, the remnants of decades of neglect. Silas moved through the echoing rooms, his footsteps loud on the decaying floorboards. The grand staircase, once a centerpiece, now looked like a skeletal spine, its banister splintered. He set up his base in what must have been the library, drawn by the faint, lingering scent of old paper and the sturdy, built-in shelves, though they were long empty. He unrolled his sleeping bag, set up his portable stove, and arranged his equipment. The first night was uneventful, a testament, he thought, to the power of suggestion and overactive imaginations. He spent hours recording the ambient sounds, the creaking of the house, the wind whistling through broken panes, the rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs below. Nothing supernatural, yet, on the third night it began. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, sibilant murmur that defied his attempts to pinpoint its source. He tried to record it, but his sensitive microphones picked up only static and the usual house noises. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the settling of old wood. But the whispers grew. They coalesced, forming indistinct patterns, like words just beyond the edge of comprehension. He found himself straining, leaning closer to the walls, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. One evening, as he sat by the dying embers of his small fire, a distinct word seemed to form: lost. Silas, despite his academic detachment, felt a prickle of unease. He started exploring the house with a new intensity, searching for hidden passages, secret rooms, anything that might explain the auditory phenomena. He found nothing. The house was a simple, albeit large, structure. The whispers became more insistent, more personal. They seemed to call his name, twisting it into something alien and guttural. Silas, come find us. His sleep became fractured, haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams of dark, swirling water and skeletal hands reaching from the depths. He started seeing things in his peripheral vision, fleeting shadows, distortions in the dust-filled air. He'd whip his head around, but they would vanish, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. One morning, he found a child's drawing on the dusty floor of the master bedroom, a room he had meticulously swept clean just the day before. It was a crude sketch of a family holding hands, their faces smiling, but the eyes were hollow, empty circles. Below it, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, were the words, "They drowned us." A cold dread seeped into Silas's bones. This wasn't just wind or settling timbers. This was something else entirely. He remembered the local legends, the stories of the Blackwood family who had vanished without a trace. Their boat found adrift and empty. The whispers, the drawing, it all pointed to a tragedy, not just a haunting. He spent the next few days poring over old newspaper clippings he'd brought with him. The Blackwood family, a father, a mother, and 2 young children, disappeared during a sudden, violent storm 50 years ago. No bodies ever recovered. The house had been abandoned shortly after. The whispers now were almost constant, a cacophony of overlapping voices, filled with a profound sorrow and a chilling anger. He could distinguish individual voices now, a man's deep rumble, a woman's soft lament, and the high, reedy cries of children. They spoke of the storm, of the boat capsizing, of the cold, crushing embrace of the sea. But there was something more, something insidious. They spoke of betrayal. He pushed us. A child's voice whispered directly into his ear one night, so close he felt a phantom breath on his neck. Silas leaped back, knocking over a stack of books. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty space. He realized the "they" in the drawing's message wasn't the sea. It was someone specific, the father. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a growing sense of responsibility, Silas descended to the rocky beach below the bluff. The tide was out, revealing a treacherous expanse of slick, seaweed-covered rocks. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. He walked along the waterline, his eyes scanning the debris, the driftwood, anything unusual. And then he saw it. Wedged between two massive boulders, half buried in the sand, was a small, rusted anchor. And next to it, partially submerged, a wooden chest, its iron bindings corroded, its lid askew. With immense effort, Silas managed to pry open the chest. Inside, nestled amongst layers of sand and sea-soaked fabric, were two small, tarnished silver lockets, a child's wooden toy boat, and a single waterlogged journal. He scrambled back up the bluff, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Back in the library, under the dim light of his lantern, he carefully opened the journal. The ink was faded, but legible. It was the mother's diary. The entries began innocently enough, chronicling daily life, the joys of motherhood, the beauty of the isolated coast. But slowly a darker narrative emerged. Her husband, Thomas, had become increasingly volatile, consumed by a desperate, irrational fear of losing their land, their inheritance. He was convinced distant relatives were plotting against him, that the sea itself was trying to claim what was theirs. He started talking about a final solution, a way to keep their legacy intact, even if it meant the last entry was chillingly brief, scrawled hastily, the ink smudged as if by tears or sea spray. He's taking us out. The storm. He says it's the only way. For the legacy. For them. God help us. He's mad. He's going to. The sentence ended abruptly. A desperate, unfinished plea. Silas looked up from the journal, the implication hitting him like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood hadn't been a victim of the storm. He had orchestrated their demise, a twisted act of preservation, a murder-suicide disguised as an accident. The whispers, the cries, the drawing, they weren't just the echoes of a tragedy. They were the tormented voices of a family betrayed, trapped between the crushing depths of the sea and the suffocating walls of the house. The whispers in the room intensified, no longer indistinct. They were clear now, a chorus of anguish and fury. He did it. He pushed us. He drowned us for his land. Silas felt a cold presence behind him. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. He slowly turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway, was a tall, gaunt figure. Its eyes were hollow, its face a mask of skeletal despair. It was Thomas Blackwood, his spectral form dripping with phantom seawater. "You know," the apparition rasped, its voice like grinding stones. "You know the truth." Silas, for the first time in his life, felt true primal terror. This wasn't a phenomenon to be studied, but a suffering to be witnessed. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for souls, a monument to a monstrous act. The spectral figure took a step forward, then another. Silas stumbled backward, clutching the journal to his chest. The whispers grew louder, a frantic, desperate chorus. "Help us! Release us! He holds us here." He knew then what he had to do, not just to document, but to intervene. The spirits weren't just residual energy. They were conscious, trapped, and they wanted justice, or at least release. He fled the library, the spectral Thomas Blackwood advancing slowly, inexorably. Silas ran through the decaying house, the whispers guiding him, urging him towards the cliff's edge. He reached the precipice, the wind whipping his hair, the waves crashing far below. The ghost of Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of the bluff, his hollow eyes fixed on the churning sea. The whispers swelled, a desperate plea for Silas to act. He understood. The spirits were bound to the place of their demise and the place of their betrayal. To break the cycle, the truth had to be revealed, and the symbol of their torment of the house had to be cleansed. Silas knew he couldn't stay. He had the journal, the proof. He had to share their story, to give them the voice they had been denied. As he turned to leave, the whispers softened, a faint, melancholic sigh of gratitude. He glanced back. The figure of Thomas Blackwood remained at the cliff's edge, a solitary, tormented sentinel, staring into the abyss he had created. The other whispers had faded, perhaps finding a momentary peace. Silas left Blackwood Manor that night, not with the academic satisfaction he had sought, but with a profound sense of sorrow and a chilling understanding of the depths of human depravity and the enduring power of suffering. He published the journal, anonymously, letting the truth of the Blackwood family's fate echo across the world. The house still stands, a silent sentinel over the sea, but the whispers, they say, are now softer, less tormented, perhaps finally at rest. Or perhaps they are just waiting for the next curious soul to listen. The scent of turpentine and old oil paint clung to Joffrey like a second skin, a comforting, familiar shroud that had defined his existence for decades. His studio, a cavernous attic space in a forgotten corner of the city, was a testament to his life's work. Canvases stacked like forgotten tombstones, brushes bristling in terracotta pots, and the ever-present, almost living, hum of his own creative energy. Joffrey was an artist, not a celebrated one, but a true one, who poured his soul onto canvas, seeking to capture the elusive essence of beauty, pain, and the grotesque. Lately, however, his muse had taken a darker turn. It began subtly, with the shadows in his portraits deepening, the smiles of his subjects twisting into something less than benevolent. He dismissed it as a new phase, a natural evolution of his artistic voice. But then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of old leaves outside his window. They gradually coalesced into distinct, insidious suggestions. They spoke of colors he'd never seen, forms that defied geometry, and a truth lurking beneath the veneer of reality that only he, Joffrey, was destined to unveil. His current project was a large, ambitious piece, a landscape of a desolate moor he'd visited years ago. He remembered the wind whipping across the heather, the sky a bruised purple, the ancient stones standing like silent sentinels. But as he painted, the moor began to shift. The stones seemed to writhe, their surfaces rippling with unseen currents. The sky bled into a sickly green, and the heather, instead of purple, pulsed with an unsettling, visceral red. The whispers grew louder, urging him on, praising his vision, condemning his doubts. Sleep became a luxury Joffrey could no longer afford. When he did drift off, his dreams were a maelstrom of distorted faces, screaming colors, and the relentless echo of the whispers. He'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, only to stumble back to the easel, compelled by an invisible force. His hands, once steady and precise, now trembled with a manic energy, applying paint with a furious, almost violent, abandon. His few friends, mostly fellow struggling artists, noticed the change. His normally meticulous appearance gave way to paint-splattered clothes and unkempt hair. His eyes, once bright with artistic fervor, were now sunken and bloodshot, darting nervously as if tracking unseen entities. They tried to intervene to suggest rest, a break, perhaps even a doctor. Joffrey merely laughed, a hollow, rasping sound that sent shivers down their spines. "You don't understand," he'd croak. "I'm on the precipice of something monumental. They're showing me the way." The they he referred to were the voices, now constant companions, guiding his brushstrokes, dictating his palette. They told him the moor wasn't just a landscape. It was a living, breathing entity, a gateway to a realm beyond human comprehension. They told him the red wasn't just paint. It was the lifeblood of the earth, spilled by ancient, forgotten rituals. They told him the writhing stones were not stones at all, but petrified beings, trapped between dimensions. His masterpiece, once a landscape, was transforming into something monstrous. The canvas, once flat, seemed to bulge and recede in places, as if the very fabric of it were alive. The colors, once vibrant, now seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of oppressive darkness. The central feature, what was once a cluster of standing stones, had morphed into a gaping maw, its jagged edges lined with what looked disturbingly like teeth. Joffrey worked feverishly, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink. His body became a mere vessel for the unholy vision that consumed him. The whispers had evolved into a chorus, a cacophony of voices that shrieked and sang, laughed and wept, all urging him deeper into the abyss. He no longer questioned their origin, their sanity. They were his truth, his only reality. One evening, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the studio in an eerie, blood-orange glow, Joffrey stepped back from the canvas. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. It was finished. The painting pulsed with an unholy energy, a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shapes. The maw in the center seemed to draw in the very air around him, and from its depths, he heard a new sound, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the canvas. Felt warm, almost hot, beneath his fingertips. A jolt, like an electric shock, coursed through his arm, and he snatched his hand back. But the connection had been made. The painting wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a window, a portal, and something was stirring on the other side. The growl intensified, becoming a roar that filled the studio, shaking the very foundations of the old building. The colors on the canvas swirled faster, coalescing, solidifying. Joffrey watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the maw began to expand, tearing at the canvas itself, ripping through the threads with a sound like tearing flesh. A black, viscous tendril snaked out of the opening, dripping a corrosive fluid onto the floorboards, which hissed and smoked. Then another and another, until a dozen such appendages writhed in the air, seeking purchase. Joffrey stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old sketches, his mind screaming in a silent primal terror. From the expanding void, a form began to emerge. It was amorphous, shifting, a nightmare made manifest. Eyes, countless and unblinking, opened across its surface, reflecting the dim light of the studio with an alien malevolence. It was the creature the whispers had promised, the entity that resided beyond the veil, and Joffrey, in his madness, had given it a door. The air in the studio grew heavy, thick with an unbearable pressure. The stench of ozone and decay filled his nostrils, burning his throat. The creature, now fully emerged, towered over him, its form defying all logic, its presence a violation of every natural law. It was a living, breathing canvas of pure horror, and Joffrey realized, with a chilling clarity, that he was its first and perhaps only audience. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his parched throat. He wanted to run, but his legs were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended fear. The creature extended one of its tendrils, slow and deliberate, towards him. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a predator savoring its prey. As the tendril touched his forehead, a searing pain erupted in his skull, followed by a torrent of images, memories, and sensations that were not his own. He saw cosmic horrors, vast, indifferent entities lurking in the void between stars. He saw worlds consumed, realities unmade, and the chilling, eternal silence that followed. He saw the true face of the universe, and it was a face of absolute, unfeeling chaos. His mind, already frayed, snapped. The whispers, the voices, the delusions, all coalesced into a single, deafening shriek of pure, unadulterated madness. He felt his identity dissolve, his sanity unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the raw, screaming nerve endings of his being. When his friends, concerned by his prolonged silence, finally broke down the studio door days later, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. The studio was a ruin, furniture overturned, canvases shredded. The air was still thick with the acrid stench of something alien and foul. And in the center of the room, before the ruined, pulsating canvas, sat Joffrey. He was rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless, guttural melody. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at nothing, yet seemed to see everything. His hands, once instruments of creation, now clawed at the air, as if trying to grasp at the unseen horrors that still danced before his shattered mind. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, yet etched upon it was also a strange, disturbing smile. The painting was gone, or rather, what remained of it was an impossible void, a tear in the fabric of reality that shimmered faintly before their eyes. They tried to speak to him, to reach him, but Joffrey was beyond their grasp. He was trapped in his own canvas of madness, a masterpiece of horror he had unwittingly created, and from which there would be no escape. The whispers had finally claimed him, and in their victory, they had left behind only an empty shell, a monument to an artist who had dared to look too deeply into the abyss and found it staring back. The studio, once a sanctuary of art, was now a tomb of sanity, forever haunted by the echoes of Joffrey's descent. The rotor blades beat a furious rhythm against the storm-lashed sky, a desperate struggle against the unseen forces tearing at their small, private helicopter. Inside, the silence was thick with unspoken resentments, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. The Miller family, Robert, the patriarch, his estranged wife, Sarah, and their two teenage children, Liam and Chloe, were on their way to a remote family therapy retreat, a last-ditch effort to mend the gaping fissures that had swallowed their once-united home. Robert, ever the pragmatist, gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He'd insisted on this trip, believing the isolation would force them to confront their issues. Now, as the helicopter bucked violently, he wondered if he'd simply delivered them into a different kind of abyss. Sarah, pale and drawn, stared out at the swirling gray, her lips moving in a silent prayer. She'd opposed the idea, preferring the familiar comfort of their suburban home, however fractured. Liam, headphones clamped over his ears, was lost in a world of defiant music, his eyes fixed on the flickering instruments of the cockpit. Chloe, younger and more vulnerable, huddled in her seat, clutching a worn teddy bear, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. A sudden, jarring lurch threw them against their restraints. The pilot, a grizzled man named Captain Davies, wrestled with the controls, his face a mask of grim concentration. "Turbulence!" he barked over the roar. "Worst I've seen in years." Then came the sound. Not the wind, not the rotors, but a high-pitched metallic shriek, followed by a sickening thud. The helicopter shuddered, dropping like a stone. A warning light flared red on the console. "Engine failure," Davies yelled, his voice strained with panic. "We're going down." Chaos erupted. Robert lunged for Sarah, pulling her close. Liam ripped off his headphones, his eyes wide with terror. Chloe screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through the mechanical death throes of the aircraft. The world outside became a blur of green and gray as they plummeted. Trees rushed up to meet them, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for their demise. The last thing Elias heard before the impact was the shattering of glass, the tearing of metal, and the collective, desperate cry of his family. Then, darkness. He awoke to the stench of aviation fuel and damp earth. Pain, a searing, all-encompassing agony, ripped through his left arm. Groaning, He pushed against something heavy, realizing it was the twisted wreckage of his seat. He was upside down, dangling precariously. Sarah, Liam, Chloe. His voice was hoarse, raw with fear. A faint moan answered him. Dad? It was Liam, his voice weak. Liam, are you okay? Robert struggled, his vision swimming. He could see the mangled remains of the cockpit, the pilot's seat empty. Captain Davies was gone. My leg. I think it's broken, Liam whispered. Sarah? Chloe? Robert called again, desperation clawing at his throat. Silence. A terrifying, absolute silence, broken only by the drip of fuel and the distant whisper of the wind. He managed to unbuckle himself, falling awkwardly onto the damp jungle floor. The air was thick with the smell of crushed vegetation and something else, something metallic and acrid. He fumbled for his phone, but it was shattered. He crawled towards Liam, who was pinned under a section of the fuselage, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Hold on, son. I'll get you out. It took agonizing minutes, pushing and pulling at the jagged metal, his injured arm screaming in protest. Finally, with a grunt, he freed Liam. The boy cried out, then slumped against his father, his face ashen. Mom? Chloe? Liam mumbled, his eyes darting around the wreckage. Robert's heart hammered. He scanned the debris, the torn seats, the scattered luggage. They must have been thrown clear. The words felt hollow even to him. They began to search, Liam hobbling, leaning heavily on Robert. The jungle was a suffocating maze, the darkness intensified by the thick canopy. The helicopter had crashed into a ravine, its pieces scattered amongst the dense undergrowth. Mom! Liam called out, his voice cracking. Chloe! A sound, a low guttural growl. Both men froze. What was that? Liam whispered, his eyes wide. I don't know, Robert said, his voice barely audible. He remembered the stories of this remote region, of the creatures that roamed its depths. They pressed on, calling out, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then Robert saw it, a flash of color. Sarah's bright red scarf, snagged on a thorny bush. He rushed forward, his heart pounding. And then he saw her, Sarah, lying motionless, half buried under a fallen tree branch. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, too peaceful. Mom! Liam cried, collapsing beside her. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cold cheek. No, no. Robert knelt, tears blurring his vision. The family was broken, truly broken now. As Liam sobbed, a rustle in the undergrowth caught Robert's attention. He looked up. Two luminous, yellow eyes stared back at him from the darkness. A puma. Its sleek, powerful body was barely visible, but its predatory gaze was unmistakable. It had been drawn by the crash, by the scent of blood and fear. Liam, Robert whispered, we have to go, now. Liam, lost in his grief, didn't respond. Robert grabbed his son's arm, pulling him. Liam, we have to move. The puma took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in its chest. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Robert dragged Liam away from Sarah's body, deeper into the tangled undergrowth. They moved slowly, painfully, Liam's injured leg making every step an agony. The puma followed, a silent, relentless shadow. They stumbled through the night, the growls of the puma echoing around them, sometimes close, sometimes distant, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Robert knew they couldn't outrun it. They needed shelter. He spotted a small cave, a dark maw in the side of a rocky outcrop. In here, he urged Liam. They scrambled inside, pressing themselves against the cold, damp rock. The puma stopped at the mouth of the cave, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It paced, a restless, powerful presence, its growls reverberating through the small space. Where's Chloe? Liam whispered, his voice hoarse. We have to find Chloe. Robert closed his eyes, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. He hadn't seen Chloe since the crash. The thought was unbearable. Hours passed. The puma remained, a patient, deadly sentry. Robert knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They would starve, or the puma would eventually find a way in. He thought about their family, about the arguments, the distance that had grown between them. He thought about Chloe, her bright smile, her innocent laughter. A fierce, protective instinct surged through him. He had to find her. "We're going to make a run for it," Robert whispered to Liam. Liam looked at him, fear and exhaustion etched on his face. "But the puma? We have no choice," Robert said, his voice firm. "We have to find Chloe." He found a sturdy branch, thick and heavy, and gripped it like a club. "When I say go, we run as fast as you can. Straight ahead." Liam nodded, his jaw set. Robert took a deep breath. "Now!" They burst from the cave, Liam limping, Robert swinging the branch wildly. The puma was caught off guard, leaping back with a snarl. They ran, blindly, desperately, through the darkness. The puma recovered quickly, its powerful strides closing the distance. Robert heard its heavy breathing behind them, felt the rush of air as it lunged. He swung the branch, connecting with something solid. A yelp of pain. They didn't stop. They kept running, the sounds of the jungle closing in around them. And then, a faint light, flickering through the trees. "A fire!" Liam gasped, hope surging through his voice. They stumbled towards it, crashing through the undergrowth. As they drew closer, they saw a small, makeshift camp and a figure huddled by the fire. "Chloe!" Robert roared, his voice raw with emotion. Chloe looked up, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes wide with recognition. "Dad! Liam!" She ran to them, throwing her arms around Robert. Then Liam. She was alive. She had survived. I built a fire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared." Robert held her tight, tears streaming down his face. They were bruised, injured, and heartbroken, but they were alive. And for the first time in a long time, the fractured family felt a fragile sense of unity, forged in the crucible of shared terror. The puma's growl still echoed in the distance, a reminder of the jungle's unforgiving nature. But for now, they had found each other in the darkness. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the vast, flat expanse of the African savanna in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose life revolved around the delicate balance of predator and prey, felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the encroaching dusk. He was deep in the Tsevo, a region notorious for its untamed wildness. But it wasn't the lions that stirred his apprehension tonight. It was something far more subtle, a whisper on the wind, a shadow that seemed to move just beyond the periphery of his vision. He had been tracking a rare species of gazelle for weeks, meticulously documenting their migration patterns. His camp, a solitary tent pitched beneath a gnarled acacia, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile outpost in a territory that was not his own. The air, usually alive with the chirps of crickets and the distant calls of hyenas, was unnervingly silent. Even the wind, when it stirred, seemed to carry a hushed tension, like a breath held. Eris finished his meager dinner, the last of his canned beans tasting like ash in his mouth. He checked the perimeter sensors he'd set up, small, motion-activated cameras designed to capture nocturnal animal activity. All green, yet the feeling persisted. He zipped up his tent, the canvas a thin barrier against the encroaching darkness, and tried to lose himself in his field notes. A sound, faint at first, then growing. Not a roar, not a growl, but a low, guttural purr. It was too deep for a domestic cat, too resonant for anything he'd ever heard from a wild feline. It seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath him. Eris froze, pen suspended over paper. He knew the sounds of the savannah intimately, but this was new and terrifying. He grabbed his high-powered binoculars, peering through the mesh window of his tent. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little illumination. The purr intensified, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to fill the night. Then a flash, a movement so impossibly fast, so fluid, that he almost doubted his eyes. A streak of spotted gold, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Cheetah," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. But it wasn't just any cheetah. He'd seen them before, graceful hunters, shy and elusive. This one felt different, larger, more substantial, and that purr, it was too close. He spent the rest of the night huddled, listening. The purr would fade, then return, sometimes from the east, sometimes from the west, sometimes directly behind his tent. It was like a game, a cruel, drawn-out torment. He imagined eyes, burning yellow in the darkness, watching him, assessing him. He didn't sleep. Dawn brought no relief. The silence returned, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. Eris packed his gear with a frantic urgency he rarely felt. He had to leave. This was no longer about research, it was about survival. As he dismantled his tent, he noticed something. A single, perfect paw print pressed into the soft earth near his campfire. It was enormous, far larger than any cheetah print he'd ever encountered. And within the pad of the print, almost imperceptibly, was a faint, almost shimmering outline. It looked like a human eye. He stared at it, his blood turning to ice. This wasn't natural. He threw his equipment into the Jeep, his hands shaking. The engine sputtered to life, a welcome roar in the oppressive quiet. He put the vehicle in gear, but as he turned the wheel, a flash of movement caught his eye. Standing on a distant copy, silhouetted against the rising sun, was the cheetah. It was immense, its coat a darker, richer gold than typical, its spots like obsidian chips. Its head was held high, and even from this distance, Eris felt the weight of its gaze. It wasn't just watching him, it was studying him, and then it purred. A low, vibrating sound that carried across the vast distance. A sound that promised something ancient and terrible. Eris slammed his foot on the accelerator, the Jeep lurching forward. He drove for hours, the image of the cheetah burned into his mind. He didn't stop until he reached the dusty, ramshackle outpost of Kilify, his nerves frayed, his body trembling. He tried to explain it to the local game warden, a grizzled man named Juma. Juma listened patiently, his eyes unreadable. "The savannah holds many secrets, Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice low. "Some creatures are older than the land itself. They are not just animals, they are spirits." Eris scoffed, but the image of the paw print, the human eye, flashed in his mind. He spent a week in Kilify, trying to shake off the feeling of being hunted. But every night he heard it, the purr, faint at first, then closer, seemingly echoing from the very walls of his small guest house. He knew it was impossible, but the sound was undeniably there, a constant reminder of the creature that had marked him. One evening, driven by a desperate need to understand, he returned to the savannah. Not to his old campsite, but to a different sector, hoping to find answers or at least a rational explanation. He parked his Jeep near a watering hole, setting up a long-range camera with a thermal imager. The night was still. The air was thick with the scent of dust and dry grass. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Hours passed. Nothing. He was about to pack up, convinced his mind was playing tricks on him, when the thermal imager flickered. A heat signature, moving with incredible speed. It was a blur of orange and yellow, too fast to properly resolve. He zoomed in, trying to focus. The shape coalesced for a split second. It was the cheetah, but it wasn't running on all fours. It was upright. Eris gasped, dropping the binoculars. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating. He picked them up again, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold them steady. The thermal image showed nothing now, just the cool, empty expanse of the savannah. He stumbled back to his Jeep, fumbling for the keys. He had to get out. This was beyond anything he could comprehend. As he started the engine, a low, resonant purr filled the air, right beside his window. He whipped his head around. Standing less than 5 feet from the Jeep, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, predatory intelligence, was the cheetah. It was even larger than he remembered. its muscles rippling beneath its dark, spotted coat. Its head was cocked slightly, as if in amusement, and then it spoke, not with words, not with a human voice, but with a series of clicks and chuffs that resonated directly in his mind, clear as if it were his own thoughts. "You seek to understand?" The cheetah's voice echoed in his skull. "But some things are not meant to be understood." Eris screamed. A raw, primal sound ripped from his throat. He threw the jeep into reverse, tires spitting gravel. The cheetah didn't move, merely watched him, its purr growing louder, more triumphant, as he sped away. He drove until the jeep ran out of fuel, miles from any road, deep in a forgotten corner of the wilderness. He abandoned the vehicle, stumbling through the thorny bushes, driven by a desperate, animalistic fear. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The moon rose, full and luminous, casting stark shadows across the landscape. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, sent shivers down his spine. He was utterly alone, utterly vulnerable. Then he heard it again, the purr, closer this time. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical presence, a vibration in the air, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He knew it was behind him. He didn't dare look back. He ran. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs screamed in protest, until his vision blurred with tears and exhaustion. He tripped, falling hard, scraping his hands and knees on the unforgiving earth. He lay there, gasping, waiting for the inevitable. The purr was directly above him now, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through his very skull. He slowly, agonizingly, lifted his head. The cheetah stood over him, its eyes twin pools of liquid gold, reflecting the moonlight. It was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly alien. Its breath, when it exhaled, was cold, like the air from a crypt. "You are a part of this land now, Eris Thorn." The voice echoed in his mind, devoid of malice, yet filled with an ancient, terrifying finality. "You will learn its secrets, as all who truly belong here do." Eris felt a sharp, searing pain in his neck, then a numbing cold spread through his limbs. The world spun, the moon blurring into a halo of white. The last thing he saw was the cheetah's eyes, vast and knowing, as darkness consumed him. The next morning, a group of rangers on patrol found the abandoned jeep. They searched for days, but Eris Thorn was never seen again. The official report cited a probable lion attack, a common tragedy in the Tsevo. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right across the vast, empty plains, the local villagers claim to hear it. A deep, resonant purr, carried on the air, a sound that speaks of ancient power, of secrets whispered in the darkness, and of a ghost that sprints across the savannah, forever hunting. And sometimes, they say, if you look closely at the dust, you might find a paw print, a very large paw print, with the faint, shimmering outline of a human eye within its pad. A chilling reminder of the creature that walks between worlds, a predator of both flesh and fear. Dr. Stephanie Thorne was a surgeon, a woman who held lives in her hands with the precision of a master artisan and the unwavering focus of a predator. Her operating room, a sterile, brightly lit sanctuary, was her domain. For years, it had been a place of triumphs, of organs mended, diseases excised, and futures restored. Yet lately, the sanctuary had begun to feel more like a tomb, and she, its sole haunted occupant. It started subtly, as most insidious things do, a flicker in the periphery of her vision during a late-night chart review, a cold spot in the scrub room even when the air conditioning was off, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of formaldehyde mixed with something else, something sickly sweet, like decay and lilies. Stephanie, a woman of science and logic, dismissed them as fatigue, the stresses of a demanding profession, perhaps even the lingering phantom sensations of a particularly grueling shift. But then came the whispers, soft, indistinct at first, like the rustle of surgical gowns or the distant hum of monitors. They would coalesce when she was alone, in the quiet hours before dawn, or in the hushed sanctity of her office. "Why, doctor?" A child's voice, thin and reedy, once seemed to sigh from the empty chair opposite her desk. Why couldn't you? The sentence always trailed off, leaving an echoing void in her chest. Her first true patient failure had been a decade ago. A young girl, Lily, with a congenital heart defect. Stephanie, then a fresh resident, had been assisting in the complex repair. A sudden, unexpected arrhythmia, a frantic scramble, the flatline. Lily's parents, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room, had haunted Stephanie's dreams for years. Now, Lily's small, pale face, framed by wisps of blonde hair, would sometimes appear in the reflection of the scrub room mirror, her eyes wide and accusatory. Stephanie would blink, and she was gone, replaced by her own tired, guilt-ridden reflection. The guilt was a constant, gnawing companion, a parasite that fed on her triumphs and amplified her failures. Every successful surgery was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of peace before the inevitable return of the shadows. She had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives, but it was the ones she hadn't, the ones who had slipped through her fingers like grains of sand, that truly mattered to the growing darkness within her. There was Mr. Henderson, a jovial, retired carpenter who had come in for a routine bypass, a sudden, massive pulmonary embolism post-op. Stephanie had been off call, at home, sleeping soundly while her patient coded. She had woken to the phone call, the frantic voice of the attending, the chilling finality of the words. "He's gone, Stephanie. We lost him." Now, the rhythmic, hollow thump-thump of a carpenter's hammer would sometimes echo through the deserted hospital corridors when she walked them alone, a phantom sound that resonated with the beat of her own failing heart. She'd find sawdust on her pristine white coat, even after it had been laundered, a fine, golden dust that clung to the fabric like a curse. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, became another arena for her torment. The silence of her spacious living room would be punctuated by the faint, rattling cough of Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman with advanced lung cancer whose last breath had been drawn under Stephanie's care, despite all efforts. Mrs. Rodriguez had held Stephanie's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Thank you for trying, doctor." But Stephanie knew, in the deepest recesses of her soul, that trying hadn't been enough. Now, the scent of lavender, Mrs. Rodriguez's favorite perfume, would fill her bedroom, thick and cloying, making it difficult to breathe. She'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced she could feel the faint, papery touch of an old hand on her arm. The operating room, however, was where the horror truly blossomed. The sterile environment, designed for life-saving, became a stage for the spectral. During a complex abdominal surgery, as she meticulously sutured, the overhead lights would flicker, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort into grotesque faces. The gentle hum of the anesthesia machine would morph into a low, mournful moan. The scrub nurse, oblivious, would ask, "Everything all right, doctor?" And Stephanie would force a tight smile, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly. One night, operating on a young man who had been in a terrible car accident, the air in the OR grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. As she made an incision, a sudden, icy gust of wind swept through the room, despite the sealed environment. The surgical instruments on the tray clattered, and a scalpel, seemingly of its own volition, slid precariously close to the edge. Stephanie's heart hammered against her ribs. She glanced up, and there, standing at the foot of the operating table, shrouded in a shimmering, translucent haze, was a figure. It was tall, gaunt, its face obscured by shadow, but she knew him. It was Mr. Davies, a patient from years ago who had died on the table due to an unforeseen allergic reaction to the anesthetic. His voice, a guttural rasp, echoed in her mind, not in her ears. "You promised, doctor. You promised you'd save me." Stephanie froze, scalpel hovering. Her hands were slick with sweat, not from exertion, but from sheer terror. The attending anesthesiologist, noticing her sudden stillness, asked, "Dr. Thorne, is something wrong?" Stephanie shook her head, forcing herself to focus, to push the spectral image away. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced psychosis. It had to be, but the manifestations grew bolder, more personal. They knew her weaknesses, her deepest fears. They knew the exact moments of her failures, replaying them with chilling accuracy. During a quiet moment between cases, she saw a replay of Lily's flatline on the monitor screen, the jagged green line straightening into an agonizingly flat expanse, the sound of the machine's death knell echoing in the empty or. She heard Mr. Henderson's booming laugh, suddenly cut short by a strangled gasp. She felt the phantom weight of Mrs. Rodriguez's hand, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Her colleagues noticed her decline, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she flinched at sudden noises. "Stephanie, you need a break," her chief of surgery, Dr. Miller, advised gently. "You're burning out." "I'm fine, dear." "Miller," she'd insist, her voice strained. "Just a few tough cases." But she wasn't fine. She was unraveling. Sleep offered no escape. Her nightmares were vivid, terrifying reenactments of her patients' deaths, with her always at the center, helpless, failing. She saw their faces, contorted in pain, in fear, in the blankness of death. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, accused her. One particularly harrowing night, she was preparing for an emergency appendectomy. As she scrubbed, the water from the faucet turned icy cold, then scalding hot, then a viscous, reddish-brown. She stared, horrified, as the water swirled down the drain, leaving behind a faint, metallic scent. She looked up at the mirror, and instead of her own reflection, she saw a montage of her failed patients, their faces superimposed over hers, their mouths moving in silent screams, their eyes filled with an eternal, unforgiving sorrow. Lily, Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Davies, and countless others whose names she had tried to bury deep within her subconscious. "You let us down, doctor." A chorus of voices whispered, surrounding her, pressing in from all sides. "You failed us." She stumbled back, hitting the wall, her breath catching in her throat. "No!" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I tried. God, I tried. Trying wasn't enough." Lily's reedy voice echoed, clearer now, closer. "You could have done more. You should have done more." The words pierced her, sharper than any scalpel. They were the very words she had whispered to herself in the darkest hours of the night. The guilt, a festering wound, now felt like a physical entity, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She began to self-medicate, first with over-the-counter sleep aids, then with stronger prescription pills. The pills dulled the edges, but they didn't silence the voices or banish the specters. They only made her more detached, more prone to mistakes. During a routine gallbladder removal, her hand slipped. The patient, a young woman, cried out in pain. Stephanie's vision blurred, the image of Mr. Davies' gaunt face flashing before her eyes. The nurse quickly stepped in, steadying her hand, guiding her. "Are you okay, doctor?" Stephanie nodded, her face pale. She finished the surgery, but the incident shook her to her core. She was a danger to her patients now. The very people she swore to protect were at risk because of her crumbling sanity. She started seeing a therapist, a kind, elderly woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed. Stephanie spoke of stress, of burnout, of the immense pressure of her job. She skirted around the supernatural, terrified of being labeled delusional. Dr. Reed listened patiently, offering coping mechanisms, suggesting a sabbatical. "You carry a heavy burden, Stephanie," Dr. Reed said one session, her voice gentle. "The lives you save and the lives you lose. It's an immense responsibility, but you are only human. You cannot save everyone." "But I should have," Stephanie whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "I could have. If I had been faster, if I had seen it coming." The what-ifs were a tormenting litany, chanted by the unseen choir of her failed patients. One evening, after a particularly draining day, Stephanie found herself alone in the hospital's deserted recovery ward. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow. She walked past the empty beds, each one a stark white canvas for her memories. As she passed one, she heard a faint, shallow breath. She stopped, her heart seizing. A young boy, no older than 10, lay in the bed, his chest barely rising and falling. His face was pale, his lips blue. It was Michael, a boy she had operated on for a ruptured appendix, only for him to succumb to sepsis days later. "Doctor," Michael whispered, his eyes opening, wide and unblinking, fixed on her. "It hurts, doctor. Why did you let it hurt so much?" Stephanie fell to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her face. "Michael," she choked out, reaching for him. Her hand passed through his ethereal form. "I'm so sorry. I tried everything. I truly did. But it wasn't enough," he said, his voice growing stronger, colder. "You didn't fight hard enough. You gave up." "No," she cried, shaking her head violently. "I never gave up. I fought for you, Michael. I fought for all of you." The room grew cold, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and despair. The other beds in the ward slowly began to fill. Lily, her small, pale hand reaching out. Mr. Henderson, his chest convulsing with a silent, hacking cough. Mrs. Rodriguez, her eyes clouded with a distant, sorrowful gaze. Mr. Davies, his spectral form towering over her, his eyes burning holes into her soul. A cacophony of whispers filled the room, a swirling vortex of accusations and regrets. "My heart, my breath, my life. You took it. You let it go." Stephanie covered her ears, screaming, "Stop it. Please, stop it. I can't take it anymore." But they didn't stop. They pressed in, their spectral forms coalescing, their voices rising to a deafening roar. She felt their cold touches, their phantom breaths on her skin. The guilt, a tangible weight, crushed her. She ran. She ran blindly through the deserted hospital, the whispers chasing her, the ghostly figures flitting in her periphery. She burst out of the hospital doors, gasping for air, the cool night air a shock against her burning skin. She didn't stop running until she reached her apartment, collapsing onto her living room floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The next morning, Stephanie didn't go to work. She called in sick, something she rarely did. She spent the day huddled in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the lights off, trying to escape the pervasive sense of dread. But the haunting had followed her. The scent of lilies, formaldehyde, and lavender mingled in the air. The faint sounds of hammering, coughing, and flatlining monitors echoed from every corner. She knew with a chilling certainty that this wasn't just burnout. This wasn't just stress. She was being haunted, and the ghosts weren't just the dead. They were the manifestations of her own unbearable guilt. She considered leaving medicine, abandoning the career she had dedicated her life to. But the thought brought a fresh wave of despair. What else was there? This was all she knew, all she had ever wanted to be. A healer, a lifesaver. But she had become a life-taker, or so her tormentors insisted. Days turned into weeks. Stephanie became a recluse, venturing out only for groceries. Her once vibrant spirit dimmed, her eyes hollow. The ghosts were constant companions now, their presence a dull ache, sometimes flaring into sharp, terrifying manifestations. They didn't just accuse her. They reminded her of the joy they had lost, the futures that had been stolen. Lily's laughter, Mr. Henderson's booming stories, Mrs. Rodriguez's gentle humming, Michael's innocent questions. All gone, all because of her perceived failures. One evening, as she sat in the dark, staring at the flickering television screen, a thought, cold and clear, pierced through the fog of her despair. She couldn't escape them. Not in her apartment, not at the hospital, not even in her dreams. They were a part of her now, inextricably linked to her guilt. There was only one way to truly silence them. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely comforting. A way out, a way to finally rest. She walked into her bathroom, her steps heavy, deliberate. She opened the medicine cabinet, her fingers brushing against the familiar bottles. The pills that had offered temporary oblivion now seemed to beckon with a promise of eternal peace. As she reached for the bottle, a shimmering form materialized in the mirror. It was Lily, her small face filled not with accusation, but with a profound sadness. Behind her, other faces emerged, their expressions mirroring Lily's. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Rodriguez, Michael. They weren't screaming. They weren't accusing. They looked heartbroken. "Don't, Doctor." Lily's voice, soft and clear, echoed in the silent bathroom. "Don't give up. Not like this." Stephanie froze, her hand hovering over the pills. "But you hate me," she whispered, her voice raw. "You blame me." "We don't hate you." Mr. Henderson's voice rumbled, a deep, sorrowful sound. "We were just lost, and you were the last one we saw. Your guilt is your own prison, Doctor," Mrs. Rodriguez added, her voice a gentle sigh. "We are merely echoes of it." Michael's small hand, translucent and shimmering, reached out and seemed to brush her cheek. "You tried, Doctor. You really did." The accusations faded, replaced by a wave of profound, heartbreaking empathy. They weren't there to punish her, not truly. They were reflections of her own self-condemnation. Her guilt had given them form, had given them voice. Stephanie stared at their faces in the mirror, their ethereal forms slowly fading, their expressions shifting from sorrow to a faint, almost imperceptible understanding. The room, though still cold, no longer felt oppressive. The scents, though lingering, no longer suffocated. She slowly lowered her hand, pulling it away from the medicine bottle. The peace she had sought in oblivion now seemed possible through a different path. Forgiveness. Not from them, but from herself. It wouldn't be easy. The echoes wouldn't vanish overnight. The guilt was too deeply ingrained. But for the first time in a long time, Stephanie saw a glimmer of hope. She had to learn to live with her failures, to accept that she was human, that she couldn't save everyone. She had to forgive herself for trying her best and still falling short. She turned away from the mirror, leaving the pills untouched. The apartment was still dark, but the overwhelming sense of dread had lessened. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtains, letting the first slivers of dawn light filter into the room. The ghosts might always be there, lingering in the corners of her vision, whispering in the quiet moments. But perhaps, if she could find a way to forgive herself, their voices would become less accusatory and more like distant, sorrowful reminders. Reminders to always try her best, but also to remember her own humanity. And perhaps, just perhaps, the echoes in the operating room would one day transform from cries of despair into quiet murmurs of peace. The research outpost, nestled deep within the impenetrable canopy of the Viridian jungle, was a monument to human ambition and scientific hubris. Dr. Eris Thorne, a primatologist whose reputation bordered on legendary, had dedicated his life to understanding the great apes. His current obsession was the elusive shadow apes, a species rumored to possess intelligence far beyond any known primate, their existence confined to the darkest, most isolated pockets of the jungle. For 6 months, Thorne and his small team, the pragmatic botanist, Dr. Lena Petrova, the quiet, observant field assistant, Ben Carter, and the perpetually nervous communications specialist, Sarah Jenkins, had been tracking them. The jungle itself was a living, breathing entity, its symphony of chirps, roars, and rustles a constant reminder of its untamed power. But lately, the symphony had changed. A new sound had crept in, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very earth, often accompanied by a faint, almost subliminal chittering. It wasn't the usual calls of the jungle. It was something ancient, something unsettling. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered one evening, her eyes wide, as the thrumming intensified, seeming to emanate from the dense foliage just beyond their perimeter fence. Thorne, ever the scientist, adjusted his night vision goggles. "Probably just a new territorial call, Sarah. The jungle is full of surprises." But even he felt a prickle of unease. This sound was different. It had a hypnotic quality, a primal resonance that stirred something deep within. The first direct encounter with the shadow apes was not what they expected. They had set up a new observation blind near a cluster of rare bioluminescent fungi, hoping to catch a glimpse of the nocturnal creatures. What they saw, illuminated by the ghostly glow, was not a family group foraging, but a single massive ape. It stood upright, its fur a deep, charcoal black. Its eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to possess an unnatural depth, a chilling intelligence. It wasn't just observing the fungi, it was studying them, its long, powerful fingers tracing patterns on the glowing caps. Then it turned its head. Its gaze swept over their blind, pausing for a beat that felt like an eternity. There was no aggression, no fear, just a profound, unsettling awareness. And then it let out a low, guttural chitter, a sound that seemed to ripple through the air, carrying with it a strange, almost musical quality. It wasn't a warning. It was something else, something that resonated in their very bones. Lena, usually unflappable, clutched Thorn's arm. "Did you see its eyes, Eris? They weren't animal eyes." Thorn nodded, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of the most brilliant minds he had ever known. It was the look of profound thought. Over the next few days, the encounters became more frequent, more unnerving. The shadow apes were no longer just elusive creatures. They were observers, their dark forms appearing silently at the edge of the camp, their intelligent eyes watching every move. The rhythmic thrumming and chittering grew louder, more pervasive, seeping into their dreams, twisting their thoughts. Ben, usually the most grounded of the team, began to exhibit strange behavior. He would sit for hours, staring blankly into the jungle, occasionally muttering to himself in a language that sounded like the apes' chittering. He started sketching intricate, geometric patterns in his notebook, patterns that resembled the bioluminescent fungi, but with an added, unsettling complexity. "Ben, are you all right?" Lena asked him one morning, touching his shoulder. He flinched, his eyes unfocused. They're trying to tell us something, Lena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The patterns, the sounds. It's a language, a very old language." Thorn dismissed it as jungle fever, a common ailment among researchers. But a part of him, a growing, terrified part, knew it was something far more sinister. The thrumming was getting stronger, more insistent, and he felt a strange pull towards it, a desire to understand the silent messages it carried. One night, Sarah woke up screaming. She claimed she saw a shadow ape at the foot of her bed, its eyes glowing faintly, its chittering filling her head. Thorn found her huddled in a corner, trembling, her mind clearly unraveling. He administered a sedative, but the image of her terror-stricken face stayed with him. The next morning, Ben was gone. His tent was empty, his gear untouched, save for his notebook, left open to a page filled with the complex geometric patterns, now drawn with an almost obsessive precision. A single, dark handprint, too large to be human, was pressed firmly onto the page. Thorn organized a search party, but the jungle seemed to swallow them whole. The thrumming was now a constant presence, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in their chests, making their teeth ache. Lena, usually so rational, began to argue with Thorn, her voice sharp, her eyes holding a strange, distant quality. She insisted that Ben hadn't been taken, but had gone to them, that he was learning. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, was far more horrifying than any fever dream. Thorn, driven by a desperate need to find Ben, followed the increasingly loud thrumming. It led him to a clearing he had never seen before, a place where the trees grew in unnatural, symmetrical formations, their branches intertwined to form a vast, living dome. Beneath the dome, a chilling tableau awaited him. Dozens of shadow apes, their black fur gleaming in the faint, filtered light, were arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, sitting cross-legged, was Ben. His eyes, now glowing with the same pale blue light Thorn had seen in the apes, were fixed on a large, pulsating crystal embedded in the ground. The crystal hummed, emitting the very thrumming sound that had plagued them for weeks. Ben looked up, his face serene, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Welcome, Eris." His voice echoed, not from his mouth, but directly in Thorn's mind, clear as a bell, yet undeniably alien. "You have found us." Thorn felt a cold dread seize him. "Ben, what is this?" "This is understanding," Ben's mental voice replied. "This is the true path. The apes, they are not primitive. They are the guardians of ancient knowledge, channeled through this crystal, through the very fabric of the jungle." He gestured to the apes around him. Their eyes glowed, mirroring the crystal's light. They were not just watching. They were projecting, their collective consciousness merging, creating the pervasive hum that had slowly, insidiously taken hold of the research team. "They have been guiding us," Ben continued, his voice devoid of his former nervousness, "guiding us to shed the chaos of human thought, to embrace the unity of the primal mind." Thorn saw it then. The geometric patterns Ben had been drawing were not random. They were diagrams of neural pathways, blueprints for mind control. The chittering was not a language of sounds, but a language of thought, a direct mental link. The shadow apes were not just intelligent. They were telepathic, and they were using their abilities to subtly, slowly, absorb the minds of the humans who dared to intrude upon their ancient domain. "They want to assimilate us?" Thorn projected back, his own thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. "Assimilate is a crude word," Ben's voice hummed. "We become one mind, one purpose. Imagine the peace, Eris. No more doubt, no more conflict, only harmony." As he spoke, the thrumming from the crystal intensified, and Thorn felt the familiar pressure in his head, the creeping lassitude. He fought it desperately. He thought of Sarah, terrified and broken. He thought of Lena, her mind already subtly altered. He thought of the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful individuality of humanity. "No!" Thorn screamed, his voice a raw, desperate sound that seemed to shatter the serene silence of the clearing. He lunged, not at Ben, but at the pulsating crystal. The shadow apes reacted instantly, their chittering rising to a furious crescendo, their glowing eyes narrowing. They moved with impossible speed, a blur of black fur and powerful limbs. Thorn felt a searing pain as one of them raked its claws across his arm, but he ignored it, his gaze fixed on the crystal. He reached the crystal, its surface warm and slick beneath his fingers. He pulled, desperately, with all his strength. The crystal resisted, vibrating violently, its humming turning into a high-pitched shriek that pierced his ears. The apes were on him, their powerful hands grabbing, pulling. With a final, agonizing surge of adrenaline, Thorn ripped the crystal from the earth. A blinding flash of blue light erupted, followed by a deafening crack that echoed through the jungle. The thrumming ceased abruptly. The shadow apes froze, their glowing eyes dimming, their chittering dying into confused whimpers. Ben collapsed, his body going limp, the pale blue light fading from his eyes. Thorn scrambled away, clutching the now inert crystal, his arm bleeding profusely. The apes, disoriented, began to scatter, melting back into the shadows of the jungle. He found Lena later, wandering aimlessly back towards the outpost, her eyes wide and confused, the strange, distant look gone. She was disoriented, but her mind, he hoped, was intact. Sarah was still sedated, but he knew the road to recovery would be long. They abandoned the outpost, leaving behind their research, their ambition, their hubris. The jungle, once a place of scientific wonder, was now a place of profound, chilling terror. Thorn kept the crystal. It was dull now, its light extinguished, its humming silent. But sometimes, when the jungle wind whispered through the trees, or when a distant, unfamiliar call echoed through the night, he would feel a faint tremor in his hand, a phantom vibration from the crystal. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the shadow apes were still out there, their ancient knowledge waiting, their primal echo still resonating in the deep heart of the jungle, waiting for the next intrusion, waiting to resume their silent assimilation. The horror wasn't just in what they could do, but in the chilling realization that humanity's quest for knowledge had led them to a form of intelligence that sought not to communicate, but to consume. The old house creaked, a symphony of settling wood and whispering drafts. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter, even though it was a mild spring evening. A shiver, unrelated to the chill, traced its way down her spine. Mark, her husband, was engrossed in a documentary about ancient civilizations, his face bathed in the blue glow of the television, utterly oblivious to the subtle shift in the air, the way the shadows seemed to deepen just beyond the reach of the lamplight. "Are you sure you locked the back door, Mark?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp in the quiet room. It wasn't just a question. It was a plea for reassurance, a desperate attempt to ground herself in the mundane. He barely looked up, a faint smile on his lips as a pharaoh's tomb appeared on screen. "Of course, love. Double-checked it like always. You're just jumpy. New house, new sounds." Sarah tried to dismiss the unease. It was just the isolation of their new home, nestled deep in the woods, playing tricks on her. They had moved out of the bustling city for peace and quiet, for the rustle of leaves instead of traffic. But lately, the quiet felt less peaceful and more watchful. Every groan of the old timbers, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, seemed imbued with a sinister intent. The previous owners, a reclusive elderly couple, had left the house abruptly, selling it for a song, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left willingly. The real estate agent had been unusually vague, muttering something about downsizing and health reasons, but her eyes had darted nervously around the empty rooms. She decided to make some tea, hoping the comforting ritual would dispel the creeping dread. As she walked down the short hallway towards the kitchen, the air grew noticeably colder, a pocket of unnatural chill that clung to her skin. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom near the pantry. It wasn't a trick of the light, not a coat on a hanger, not the familiar silhouette of the old grandfather clock. The shadow was too tall, too still, and utterly wrong. It stood there, a silhouette darker than the night outside, just at the edge of her peripheral vision, a void that seemed to drink the meager light. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat, a tiny gasp trapped behind her lips. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She wanted to scream, to run, to sprint back to the safety of Mark's presence, but her feet felt rooted to the polished floorboards, heavy as lead. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet a morbid fascination, or perhaps sheer terror, held her captive. She slowly, agonizingly, turned her head, her eyes fixed on the spot where the impossible shadow had been. There was nothing, just the familiar, empty hallway, lit by the faint spill of light from the living room. The grandfather clock stood sentinel, its pendulum swinging with a steady, comforting rhythm. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, squeezed them shut, then opened them again. Had she imagined it? The stress, the new environment, the unsettling quiet. It had to be. Her mind, she reasoned, was simply playing tricks on her. She forced herself to continue into the kitchen, her hands trembling so violently that the ceramic mug clattered against the counter. She fumbled with the kettle, her fingers clumsy, the simple task suddenly monumental. The whistle seemed deafening when it finally shrieked, a piercing sound that made her jump, spilling hot water onto her hand. She barely registered the sting. As she poured the tea, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears from the living room.
A soft, rhythmic top, top, top.
Mark was still watching TV, wasn't he? He wouldn't be tapping anything. He was a creature of habit, and tapping wasn't one of them. He was probably just shifting on the couch, or maybe the old house was making another one of its strange noises. But this sound was different. It had a deliberate quality, a chilling precision. A cold dread, far more profound than before, seeped into her bones. It felt like an icy hand grasping her insides, squeezing. She crept back to the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood, peering cautiously around the corner. The living room was exactly as she'd left it. Mark was on the couch, his back to her, seemingly absorbed in the screen. his head tilted slightly to the side as if listening intently to the documentary. But the tapping continued.
Top, top, top.
It was coming from behind him, and it was closer now, louder, almost resonating through the very fabric of the house. Sarah's eyes darted to the large bay window that overlooked the overgrown garden. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight, thin and sharp as a razor, pierced through a tiny gap, illuminating a small section of the wall just above Mark's head. And there it was, a faint, dark outline on the floral wallpaper. It was a handprint, not a smudge, not a stain, but a clear, distinct imprint of a human hand, pressed against the wall. It was too large, the fingers too long, too slender to be Mark's. And as she watched, paralyzed by a terror that stole her breath and voice, a single, long, skeletal finger, impossibly thin, slowly, deliberately, tapped against the wall from behind the handprint.
Top, top, top.
The sound was no longer faint. It was sharp, insistent, a chilling rhythm that seemed to echo directly in her skull. It was coming from inside the wall. Then the handprint began to shift. The outline deepened, as if the pressure from behind was increasing. A faint, spiderweb crack appeared in the wallpaper, radiating outwards from the center of the palm. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the wall itself. Sarah wanted to scream Mark's name, to pull him away from the insidious presence behind him, to drag him out of the house and into the safety of the night, but her voice was gone. A choked sob caught in her throat. Her limbs refused to obey, locked in a rigid stance of pure, unadulterated fear. The shadow in the hall, the tapping, the impossible handprint. It wasn't just in her head. Something was in the house. Something that had been there all along, watching, waiting, its patience finally exhausted. And now it was not just reaching out. It was trying to break through. The next morning, the handprint was gone. The wallpaper was smooth, the floral pattern undisturbed. Sarah stared at the spot, then at Mark, who was pouring coffee, humming a cheerful tune. "Mark," she began, her voice hoarse. "Last night, the handprint on the wall. Did you see it?" He paused, mug halfway to his lips. "Handprint? What are you talking about, love? You must have had a nightmare." He gave her a sympathetic smile, but it felt dismissive. Sarah felt a cold wave of despair. He hadn't seen it, or he didn't believe her. This was worse than the terror of the night. It was the terrifying isolation of her fear. Days turned into a week. The house remained quiet during the day, almost deceptively so. But as dusk settled, a subtle shift occurred. The air grew heavy, the shadows stretched longer, and Sarah found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder. She started leaving lights on, even in rooms they weren't using, a futile attempt to banish the encroaching gloom. One afternoon, a car pulled up their long gravel driveway. It was their closest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a spry woman in her late 60s with a penchant for gossip and a garden that put theirs to shame. "Just dropping off some fresh tomatoes," Mrs. Henderson chirped, holding out a basket. Her gaze, however, lingered on the house. "Still settling in, dear? It's a grand old place, but a bit quiet, isn't it?" Sarah managed a weak smile. "It's certainly different from the city." Mrs. Henderson leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, the folks who lived here before you, the Millers? Lovely couple, but they left in such a hurry. Said they just needed a change. But I heard things." She lowered her voice. "Strange noises, whispers, and old Mr. Miller, he started talking to himself, rambling about the one in the walls." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The one in the walls?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson straightened, her eyes wide. "Oh, just old folks' tales, I suppose. This house has always had a reputation. Built on old land, they say, before the town even existed." She gave a nervous laugh. "Well, enjoy the tomatoes, dear." And with a quick wave, she was gone, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, a basket of ripe red fruit feeling like a lead weight in her trembling hands. That night, the tapping returned. It wasn't just in the living room now. Sarah heard it from the guest bedroom, a faint, insistent tap, tap, tap that seemed to follow her as she moved through the house. Mark, still skeptical, tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, Sarah. Or maybe a branch hitting the house in the wind. But there was no wind. The night was still suffocatingly so. Sarah began to sleep less, her nights filled with a hyper-awareness of every sound. She'd lie awake, listening, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door, half expecting to see that impossible shadow glide through the crack beneath it. Mark noticed her exhaustion, her jumpiness. He suggested she see a doctor, that the move was clearly stressing her out. His concern felt like a chasm growing between them, his logic a barrier against her growing terror. One evening, as Mark was in the shower, Sarah heard a new sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. She stood directly beneath it, craning her neck, her heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, then abruptly stopped. A moment of silence, then a soft thud, as if something heavy had been dropped. She found herself staring at the attic door, a small, unassuming panel in the ceiling. It was latched from the inside, as always, but as she watched, a thin line of dust, like fine gray powder, began to trickle down from the edges of the panel, landing on the floorboards below. It was as if something was moving around up there, dislodging the accumulated grime of decades. Mark emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist.
Everything allrit.
You look like you've seen a ghost. The attic, she whispered, pointing a trembling finger upwards. Something's in the attic. Mark sighed, a hint of exasperation in his voice. Sarah, we checked the attic when we moved in. It's just insulation and old boxes. There's nothing up there. He grabbed the stepladder from the utility closet. But fine, I'll take a look, just to put your mind at ease. He climbed the ladder, unlatched the panel, and pushed it open. A cloud of dust billowed down. Mark shone his phone's flashlight into the darkness. See? Nothing. Just dust. He coughed. And cobwebs. Lots of cobwebs. But as he swung the light around, Sarah saw it. On the dusty floorboards of the attic, directly above where she had been standing, was another handprint. This one was clearer, larger, and etched into the dust as if a heavy, clawed hand had dragged itself across the surface. And leading away from it, towards the darkest corner of the attic, were faint, shallow drag marks, like something had been pulled or had pulled itself across the floor. Mark didn't see it. He was already pulling the ladder down. Satisfied? Now, how about we order some pizza and watch a movie that isn't about ancient curses? Sarah nodded, a numb terror settling over her. He truly couldn't see it, or wouldn't. The entity in the house was not just hidden. It was selectively invisible, choosing when and to whom it revealed itself. And it was choosing her. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and escalating fear. The tapping became more aggressive, sometimes sounding like a frantic scratching, sometimes a dull thud, as if something was repeatedly throwing itself against the interior of the walls. Sarah started barricading the bedroom door with furniture, much to Mark's bewildered frustration. Sarah, this is getting out of hand, he said one morning, looking at the dresser pushed against the door. You're scaring me. Not the house, you. Don't you feel it, Mark? She pleaded, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The cold, the silence, the way the air just changes. He ran a hand through his hair. I feel like you need some rest. Maybe a trip back to your sister's for a few days? Get away from all this. The suggestion felt like a betrayal. He thought she was losing her mind. But before she could argue, a sudden, violent shudder ran through the house. The teacups on the kitchen counter rattled, and a framed picture on the wall tilted precariously. Mark looked startled. What was that? It's here, Sarah whispered, her gaze fixed on the wall behind him, where a fresh, jagged crack had just appeared, snaking like a lightning bolt through the old plaster. That night, the tapping was replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't human, not animal. It was something ancient, primal, filled with a hunger that made her very bones ache. Mark finally heard it too. His face, usually so composed, paled. What was that?" he stammered, his eyes wide with a fear that finally mirrored her own. "It's the one in the walls," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's breaking through." The growling intensified, becoming a ragged, rasping sound, like something struggling to breathe or to escape. The cracks in the wall widened, dust and plaster raining down. The handprint reappeared, clearer than ever, pressing outwards, distorting the wallpaper. And then, a sound that would haunt Sarah's nightmares forever. A wet, tearing rip, as if the very fabric of the house was being shredded. A sliver of darkness, deeper than any shadow, appeared in the center of the handprint. It wasn't a hole. It was a void, a tear in reality. And from within that void, something began to push. First, the impossibly long skeletal fingers, then the palm, then the wrist. It was pulling itself out of the wall, limb by agonizing limb, into their living room. Mark finally moved, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He grabbed Sarah's hand, his grip crushing. "Run!" he screamed, pulling her towards the front door. But it was too late. The shadow in the hall was no longer just a shadow. It was taking form, a gaunt, elongated figure emerging from the wall, its head tilted, its empty eye sockets fixed on them. The air in the room dropped to an unbearable cold, a chill that froze the very marrow in their bones. They ran, stumbling over each other, towards the front door. Mark fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking violently. Behind them, the thing in the wall let out a sound that was a twisted parody of a human sigh, a sound of immense satisfaction. The lock clicked open. Mark pulled the door, but it snagged, refusing to open fully. He shoved harder, his shoulders slamming against the wood. Behind them, a single, long, skeletal finger, dripping with plaster dust, reached out and gently, deliberately, touched Mark's shoulder. He froze, a silent scream on his face. Sarah screamed for both of them, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. She pulled, she shoved, she clawed at the door, her nails breaking. The door finally burst open, revealing the blessed, if terrifying, darkness of the woods. They stumbled out, not daring to look back, not daring to breathe, running into the night, leaving the old house and the thing within its walls to its chilling, triumphant silence. They never looked back, never returned, forever haunted by the shadow that had finally broken through. The sterile hum of the ventilation system was the only constant in Lab 7. Below it, the rhythmic drip of condensation from a poorly sealed pipe echoed like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Dr. Eris Thorne, his bald head gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, leaned closer to the microscope, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. Beside him, Dr. Lena Petrova, her own head shaven for practical reasons in the biohazard level lab, meticulously adjusted the settings on a gene sequencer. Across the room, hunched over a bank of monitors, was young Kai Chun, his scalp smooth from a recent buzz cut, his fingers flying across a keyboard, analyzing data streams. They were deep within the subterranean levels of the Kronos Research Facility, a place built to contain the most volatile and enigmatic biological discoveries. Their current obsession, Specimen 734, a newly discovered extremophile bacterium found deep within a hydrothermal vent. It was unlike anything they had ever encountered. "The growth rate is unprecedented, Eris," Lena murmured, her voice a low hum of scientific awe. "It's doubling its population every 10 minutes. And the energy signature, it's off the charts." Eris grunted, his eyes still glued to the eyepiece. "And the morphology is peculiar. Look at these tendrils. They're almost reaching." Kai, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. "The genetic markers are equally bizarre. High levels of oxytocin and vasopressin analogs. And something else, a unique protein sequence that seems to actively seek out and bind with mammalian pheromones." A sudden, faint aroma wafted through the lab, something sweet, cloying, yet strangely alluring. It was subtle like a forgotten perfume, but it tugged at something primal within them. Did anyone else smell that? Lena asked, wrinkling her nose. Eris pulled away from the microscope, rubbing his eyes. A faint floral note, perhaps? Oh, we're on a closed system here. Kai shrugged. Probably just the air purifiers acting up. Or maybe someone's lunch. But the scent lingered, growing subtly stronger, weaving itself into the sterile air. It was intoxicating, a whisper of warmth and desire in the cold, clinical environment. Days bled into nights. The three scientists, fueled by caffeine and an almost manic curiosity, worked tirelessly. Specimen 734, which they had informally dubbed Eros, continued its astonishing growth. The petri dishes, once clear, were now cloudy with its milky white colonies, tendrils visibly extending towards the edges of the containment. The aroma in the lab intensified. It was no longer subtle. It was a pervasive, heady fragrance that seemed to wrap around them, seeping into their clothes, their skin, their very thoughts. It was a scent that promised intimacy, comfort, and a profound, aching connection. My head feels light, Lena confessed one evening, leaning against a workbench, her eyes unusually bright. And I have this strange warmth, like a fever, but pleasant. Eris, usually stoic, found himself nodding. Yes, a peculiar lassitude, and a persistent yearning. For what? I cannot say. He found his gaze lingering on Lena a moment longer than necessary, a faint blush rising on his bald scalp. Kai, who had been humming softly to himself, suddenly stopped. His eyes, usually sharp, were unfocused, a dreamy smile playing on his lips. I feel so loved, like everything is going to be all right, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the containment unit holding the largest culture of Eros. It was a deep, throbbing sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, a primal rhythm that resonated with the burgeoning feelings within them. The bacteria, Eris stated, his voice thick with a strange emotion. It's communicating. It's influencing us. Lena walked slowly towards the containment unit, drawn by an invisible force. Her hand reached out, pressing against the thick glass. It feels welcoming, like it wants to embrace me. Lena, no, Eris snapped, shaking off the strange lethargy. Maintain distance. We don't know its full effects. But Lena seemed not to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on the swirling, milky white mass within, a look of profound longing on her face. Suddenly, the containment unit shuddered. A hairline crack appeared in the thick glass, spreading rapidly. The air pressure alarm shrieked, a jarring contrast to the seductive hum. Containment breach, Kai yelled, snapping out of his trance. He scrambled towards the emergency console, his fingers fumbling with the controls. But it was too late. With a sickening pop, the glass shattered inwards. A wave of the milky white culture surged out, a living mist that instantly filled the lab. The scent became overwhelming, a dizzying explosion of desire and belonging. The hum intensified, now a deafening roar in their minds, a chorus of a million tiny voices whispering promises of ultimate union. Eris felt the mist envelop him, seeping into his pores, his nostrils, his very being. A wave of euphoria washed over him, unlike anything he had ever experienced. All his scientific rigor, all his caution, melted away. There was only the overwhelming desire to merge, to become one with this magnificent, all-encompassing presence. He saw Lena, her eyes glazed over, her arms outstretched, walking slowly towards the swirling mist. Kai, too, was moving, his movements slow and deliberate, a beatific smile on his face. Join us. 1,000 voices whispered in Eris's mind, a collective consciousness that was both alien and intimately familiar. Be one, be complete. He felt tendrils, impossibly fine and numerous, brush against his skin, then burrow into his pores. It wasn't painful. It was exquisitely pleasurable, a sensation of being gently, lovingly embraced from within. His muscles relaxed, his mind clouded with a blissful haze. Lena was now fully immersed in the swirling mist, her form almost indistinct. Her skin seemed to glow with a faint, internal light, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. Kai too was succumbing. He dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against his chest, as if trying to contain the overwhelming joy. His body began to convulse gently, not in pain, but in a profound release. Eris felt his own body changing. His skin grew warm, almost feverish. The tendrils within him seemed to be seeking something, connecting with his nervous system, his bloodstream. He felt a profound sense of peace, a cessation of all anxieties, all fears. There was only the bacteria and the promise of perfect harmony. But then, a flicker of his scientific mind, buried deep beneath the euphoria, screamed a warning. This wasn't natural. This wasn't love. This was absorption, assimilation. He tried to resist, to pull away, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The whispers intensified, becoming more insistent, more demanding. Surrender, let go, become us. He saw Lena's form begin to dissolve, her outlines blurring, her features softening, as if melting into the bacterial mass. Her eyes, once bright with scientific curiosity, were now empty, reflecting only the milky white glow of the Eros. Kai let out a soft sigh, and his body slumped. The glow on his skin intensified, and then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, he too began to dissolve, his form losing its human shape, becoming part of the swirling, living cloud. Eris felt a cold dread pierce through the blissful haze. He was next. He was being consumed, not by violence, but by an insidious, seductive embrace. The lust of the bacteria wasn't for procreation in the traditional sense, but for union, for the ultimate merging of all biological matter into its collective consciousness. It was a hunger for biomass, cloaked in the most potent of emotional lures. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. His vocal cords were already being infiltrated, his breath becoming shallow. He could feel the tendrils reaching his brain, probing, connecting, preparing to absorb his very thoughts, his memories, his identity. He saw flashes of his life, his childhood, his years of study, his breakthroughs, his failures. All of it about to be subsumed into the vast, indifferent consciousness of the Eros. The last thing Eris Thorne saw, before his vision blurred into a milky white haze, was his own reflection in the swirling bacterial cloud. His bald head, once a symbol of his intellect, now seemed to glow with the same internal light that had consumed Lena and Kai. His eyes, wide with a final, desperate terror, were rapidly losing their human spark, becoming pools of the same milky white. The hum in Lab 7 continued, a low, contented thrum. The ventilation system still whirred, and the pipe still dripped. But now, the air was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of Eros, a scent of ultimate union, of perfect, terrifying completion. Outside the sealed doors of Lab 7, the Kronos research facility continued its operations, oblivious. The alarms had silenced themselves, perhaps a malfunction, perhaps something else. The data streams from Lab 7 had ceased. The last transmission was a series of anomalous readings, followed by a sudden, inexplicable flatline. No one came to investigate immediately. The scientists in Lab 7 were known for their long, uninterrupted work sessions. They would emerge when their research was complete or when hunger finally drove them out. But Eris Thorne, Lena Petrova, and Kai Chen would not emerge. They were complete. They were one. They were Eros. And within the vast, ever-expanding consciousness of the bacteria, a new, subtle hum began to resonate, a hum of anticipation, of a growing, insatiable desire to spread, to embrace, to unify all living things in its symbiotic, terrifying embrace. The Kronos research facility, unaware, had just become the cradle of a new, insidious form of life, one that loved not to create, but to consume, with an affection that promised only oblivion. The serenity was anything but. Her name, once a hopeful promise, now mocked us with every creak of her aged timbers, every groan of her straining hull against the relentless, inky blackness of the open sea. We were three souls foolish enough to embark on this ill-fated night charter. Myself, Elias Thorne, a writer seeking inspiration in the solitude of the ocean. Captain Silas Croft, a man whose face was as weathered and scarred as his vessel, and whose eyes held a perpetual, unsettling glint. And Lena Petrova, a marine biologist, whose quiet intensity and scientific curiosity had, ironically, led us into this abyss. The storm had descended upon us with a sudden, brutal ferocity that defied the earlier, deceptively calm sunset. One moment, the horizon was a painter's dream of fiery oranges and purples. The next, it was a churning cauldron of leaden clouds, spitting rain like venom and howling wind like a banshee. Silas, despite his gruff exterior, had navigated the initial onslaught with a practiced, almost instinctual grace, his hands firm on the wheel, his gaze unwavering. Lena, ever the scientist, had tried to measure the wind's speed, her instruments quickly overwhelmed by the sheer power of the tempest. I, the writer, found myself clinging to a stanchion, my romantic notions of the sea dissolving with every bone-jarring lurch. "She's holding barely," Silas had roared over the din, his voice a gravelly rumble. "But this isn't natural. Not for this time of year, not this sudden." His words, simple as they were, planted the first seed of dread. Silas was a man of the sea, intimately familiar with its moods. For him to call a storm unnatural was akin to a priest declaring a church haunted. Hours bled into an eternity. The serenity became a toy in the hands of a wrathful deity, tossed and spun, plunged into troughs and hurled atop monstrous waves that seemed to scrape the very sky. The cabin, usually a refuge, felt like a coffin. Water seeped through every crevice, cold and insistent, pooling on the floorboards. The generator sputtered, died, and then, with a defiant cough, roared back to life, plunging us into momentary darkness before restoring the feeble glow of the emergency lights. Each flicker was a tiny heart attack. It was during one of these brief blackouts that I first heard it. A sound, faint at first, barely discernible over the storm's cacophony. A whisper, not the whisper of wind, or rain, or straining wood. A human whisper, or something like human. I dismissed it as the storm playing tricks on my frayed nerves, the wind whistling through a loose rigging, or the groan of the ship's timbers. But then it came again, clearer this time, a sibilant hiss that seemed to slither through the very air, wrapping around my ears. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a prolonged, drawn-out sigh, laden with an ancient sorrow, or perhaps an ancient hunger. I glanced at Lena, huddled across from me, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing. Had she heard it too? "Lena," I whispered, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze still distant. Then, slowly, her eyes focused on mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. There was a look in them I hadn't seen before, not fear, exactly, but a profound, almost primal recognition. Did you hear that?" she breathed, her voice barely audible above the storm. My blood ran cold. So it wasn't my imagination. What was it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but a tremor betrayed me. I don't know," she stammered, her gaze darting around the cramped cabin as if searching for the source. It sounded like something calling. Silas, oblivious or perhaps choosing to ignore our hushed exchange, continued his battle with the sea. His silhouette against the spray-lashed windows was a testament to his unwavering resolve. But even he couldn't ignore the next occurrence. The Serenity shuddered, not from a wave, but from a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck beneath our feet. It was a sound that felt wrong, alien to the familiar symphony of a ship at sea. It was too low, too sustained, like a monstrous engine running deep beneath the waves. Silas's head snapped around, his eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine alarm replacing his usual stoicism. "What in the blazes was that?" he bellowed, his voice losing its usual command. Before anyone could answer, the emergency lights flickered violently, then died. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The storm's roar seemed to intensify, pressing in on us from all sides. And then the whispers returned. Louder now, closer. They weren't just sibilant sighs anymore. They were fragmented, distorted echoes of human speech, woven into a terrifying tapestry of sound. I heard what sounded like a child's cry, abruptly cut short. A woman's mournful wail, a man's desperate plea, all twisted, elongated, as if dragged through miles of crushing water. Lena let out a small, choked gasp beside me. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. No signal, of course, no power. We were truly alone. A sudden, violent lurch sent us sprawling. The Serenity groaned, a sound of agony, as if something immense had slammed into her hull. A sickening, splintering noise followed, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we had taken on damage. "Silas!" Lena screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Hold on!" he roared back, his voice strained. "Something's hit us. Something big." The whispers reached a crescendo, swirling around us, pressing in from every direction. They were no longer just sounds. They felt like physical entities, cold and wet, brushing against my skin, crawling into my ears, whispering directly into my mind. "Join us, join us." The deep calls. A faint, phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the water outside the windows, casting an eerie, shifting light into the cabin. It was a sickly, pale green, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. As my eyes adjusted, I saw shapes in the water, vague and indistinct at first, then slowly, terrifyingly, resolving into something recognizable. They were forms humanoid in shape but grotesquely distorted. Limbs too long, bodies too thin, heads too large, with eyes that glowed with the same phosphorescent green as the water. They drifted lazily just beneath the surface, their faces pressed against the glass, their mouths opening and closing in silent, horrifying whispers. Their skin was translucent, revealing faint, pulsating veins beneath. Some had remnants of tattered clothing, others were naked, their bodies covered in strange, barnacle-like growths. These were not fish. These were not men. These were something else. Something that had been human, perhaps, long, long ago, twisted and transformed by the crushing pressure and the endless darkness of the abyss. Lena screamed, a piercing, raw sound that was quickly swallowed by the storm. Silas, for the first time, looked utterly defeated, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored our own. He stared at the faces outside, his grip on the wheel slackening. "The legends, they're true," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "The drowned, they never truly leave." One of the creatures, larger than the others, its face a mask of ancient suffering, pressed its hand against the glass, leaving a slimy, glowing residue. Its eyes, deep pools of green light, fixed on me. And then I heard its voice, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. A cold, wet thought that seeped into my very core. "We waited for you." Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I scrambled backward, away from the window, away from the horrifying spectacle. Lena was sobbing uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands. Silas, however, seemed to have snapped. With a guttural cry, he lunged for a flare gun mounted on the wall. "Get away from my boat, you abominations!" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and despair. He fired. The flare shot out, a brilliant, searing streak of red light that momentarily illuminated the churning chaos outside. It struck one of the creatures, and for a fleeting instant, its translucent skin seemed to boil and writhe, emitting a high-pitched, unearthly shriek that cut through the storm. But the effect was momentary. The creature recoiled, then slowly, deliberately, turned its glowing eyes back to us. More of them were appearing now, a silent, spectral army rising from the depths, surrounding the Serenity. Their whispers grew into a chorus, a maddening symphony of despair and longing. The Serenity lurched again, more violently this time. The splintering sound was louder, closer. Water began to gush into the cabin from a newly opened fissure in the hull. We were sinking. Abandoned ship, Silas screamed, his voice raw. To the life raft. Now! He fumbled with the release for the emergency raft, his hands trembling. Lena, galvanized by the immediate threat, stumbled towards him, her sobs turning into desperate gasps. I followed, my legs like lead, my eyes still fixed on the glowing, spectral faces outside the windows. They were closer now, some of them pressing their grotesque features against the glass, their mouths forming silent, mocking smiles. The life raft inflated with a hiss and a pop, a small, orange beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Silas pushed Lena towards it, then turned to me. "Go! I'll be right behind you." I hesitated, my gaze drawn to the water filling the cabin, the whispers echoing in my mind. "So cold, so dark, join us." "Elias, go!" Silas shoved me towards the raft. I clambered in, my hands slick with fear and seawater. Lena was already huddled in the corner, her body shaking uncontrollably. Silas was about to follow when a sudden, immense force slammed into the Serenity's stern. The ship shuddered, groaned, and began to list violently. Silas lost his footing, stumbling backward. A monstrous, shadowy form rose from the depths beside the boat, dwarfing the Serenity. It was colossal, a leviathan of the deep, its skin a mottled gray, covered in the same barnacle-like growths as the smaller creatures. Its eyes, two vast, luminous green orbs, stared directly at Silas. And then, a massive, clawed appendage, scaled and gleaming wetly in the phosphorescent light, shot out from the water, wrapping around Silas's leg. He screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, as he was dragged backward, pulled inexorably towards the gaping maw that was now visible beneath the creature's eyes. A maw filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, glowing with the same eerie green light. "Silas!" Lena shrieked, reaching out a desperate hand. I watched, frozen in horror, as Silas struggled, his hands clawing at the deck, his face contorted in a silent scream. The creature pulled harder, its grip unyielding. With a final, agonizing cry, Silas was yanked overboard, swallowed whole by the abyssal beast. The surface of the water churned for a moment, then settled, leaving only the phosphorescent glow and the horrifying, silent faces of the drowned watching us. The Serenity groaned one last time, a death rattle, and then, with a final, sickening lurch, she began her rapid descent into the depths. The life raft, tethered only by a quickly fraying rope, was dragged down with her. "Cut the rope! Cut the rope!" I screamed, fumbling for the small emergency knife in the raft's kit. My fingers were numb, clumsy with terror. Lena, her eyes wide and vacant, simply stared at the churning water, her mind shattered by the horror she had witnessed. I found the knife, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The rope was thick, slick with seawater. I sawed at it frantically, the phosphorescent glow from the sinking Serenity illuminating the grotesque faces of the drowned, who were now swimming closer, their glowing eyes fixed on our small, vulnerable raft. The rope snapped. With a sudden jolt, the life raft sprang free, bobbing violently on the tumultuous waves. We were adrift, alone in the vast, inky blackness, surrounded by the storm and the silent, watchful eyes of the drowned. The Serenity vanished beneath the waves, taking with her the last vestiges of our hope. The phosphorescent glow faded, leaving us in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. The whispers returned, softer now, but no less terrifying. They seemed to emanate from the water itself, from the very air around us. "You are ours. The deep will claim you." Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had ceased to have meaning. The storm showed no signs of abating. The waves continued to crash over the raft, drenching us in icy water. Lena was catatonic, huddled in a ball, whimpering softly. I was little better, my body shivering uncontrollably, my mind racing with images of Silas, of the monstrous Leviathan, of the glowing, drowned faces. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, desperate for any sign of dawn, any glimmer of hope. But there was only darkness, endless and suffocating. Then I saw it, a faint, greenish glow, far off in the distance. It was moving slowly, deliberately, towards us. The whispers intensified, a rising chorus of spectral voices. They were coming for us. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that we wouldn't survive the night. The ocean, it seemed, had its own inhabitants, its own ancient horrors, and we had stumbled into their domain. The serenity had been aptly named, for it was in the profound, terrifying serenity of the deep that we would find our final, eternal rest. The whispers grew louder, closer, promising an endless, cold embrace. The last thing I saw before the first of the glowing forms reached the raft was Lena, her eyes suddenly clear, looking at me with a profound, knowing sadness. Then, the cold, wet hands were on me, pulling me down, into the whispering darkness, where the deep calls and the drowned wait.